Dogman of Autumn Woods. Dean Smith, a native of Boulder, Colorado, had always been an outdoor enthusiast. Boulder, known for its stunning flatirons and the majestic Rocky Mountains, was a haven for hikers and nature lovers. Dean grew up exploring the trails and camping under the stars, so when his friends suggested a camping trip in the autumn woods, he eagerly agreed. The group of friends, consisting of Dean, Sarah, Mike, and Lisa, set out on a crisp autumn morning. The leaves had turned vibrant shades of red, orange, and yellow, creating a picturesque backdrop for their adventure. They hiked deep into the woods, far from the beaten path, and set up camp near a small, serene lake. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the friends gathered around the campfire, sharing stories and laughter. Dean couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. He had heard tales of a creature known as the Dogman, a half-man, half-dog beast that prowled these woods. The stories were often dismissed as mere folklore, but something about the stillness of the night made him uneasy. The first encounter happened just as the fire began to die down. Dean heard a rustling in the bushes and saw a pair of glowing eyes staring at them from the darkness. He froze, his heart pounding in his chest. The creature stepped into the light, revealing its grotesque form. It stood on two legs, covered in matted fur, with the head of a snarling dog. The Dogman. The friends screamed and scrambled to their feet. The Dogman let out a bone-chilling howl and lunged at them. Dean grabbed a burning log from the fire and swung it at the creature, managing to wound it. The Dogman yelped and retreated into the shadows, but Dean knew it wasn't gone for good. "We need to get out of here," Dean said, his voice trembling. "Now." They quickly packed up their gear and began their frantic journey out of the woods. The path was treacherous, with roots and rocks threatening to trip them at every step. The Dogman stalked them from the shadows, its eyes glowing in the darkness. As they made their way through the dense forest, Dean's thoughts drifted to his family. He remembered his father's stories about the Dogman, told around the campfire when he was a child. His mother, always the voice of reason, would reassure him that it was just a story. But now, faced with the reality of the creature, Dean wished he could hear her comforting words again. The group pressed on, their fear driving them forward. They reached a narrow ravine, and as they carefully made their way across, the Dogman attacked again. This time, it targeted Mike, dragging him into the darkness. The others could only watch in horror as their friend disappeared, his screams echoing through the trees. With heavy hearts, they continued their escape. The forest seemed to close in around them, the shadows growing longer and darker. Dean led the way, his mind racing with thoughts of survival. He knew they had to reach the main trail before the Dogman caught up with them again. Finally, after what felt like hours, they emerged from the woods and stumbled onto the main trail. They didn't stop running until they reached their car, parked at the edge of the forest. They piled in and sped away, the haunting howls of the Dogman fading into the distance. As they drove back to Boulder, Dean couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had settled over him. He had lost a friend to the creature, and the memories of that night would haunt him forever. The Dogman was no longer just a story. It was a terrifying reality. Stalked by the unknown. Michael Russell grew up in Lawrence, Kansas, a charming college town known for the University of Kansas, the vibrant Massachusetts street, and its historical ties to the Civil War. He loved the endless fields that stretched beyond the city and the warm, tight-knit community. Growing up, Michael was a typical Midwesterner, friendly, pragmatic, and deeply rooted in family traditions. His dad had taught him to shoot a BB gun in their backyard when he was 10, and his mom was the kind of person who never let anyone leave the house without a hug and a sandwich. But those memories felt distant as he and his three closest friends, Sam, Jordan, and Clara, embarked on their summer road trip. Their destination was a sprawling national park in Oklahoma. But along the way, they decided to take an unexpected detour to a small town to refuel and explore. The town one wasn't on their itinerary, and its name, Pine Hollow, was unfamiliar to all of them. It was midday when they pulled into a rundown gas station at the edge of the town. The station's peeling paint and the ancient pump handles told stories of neglect. Michael went inside to pay and grab some snacks. The cashier, an older man with a weathered face, stared at him with unsettling intensity. "Y'all shouldn't linger too long," the man said as he rang up Michael's purchases. "The woods around here. Strange things happen." Michael chuckled nervously, not wanting to show he was rattled. He'd grown up hearing local legends back in Kansas, but they were just that. Stories. After the gas station stop, the group decided to spend a few hours in the area, intrigued by the nearby hiking trails advertised on a faded billboard. The woods were dense and quiet, with the occasional rustle of leaves breaking the eerie stillness. As they ventured deeper into the forest, Michael couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. He remembered the strange look the cashier had given him, and unease settled in his chest. Then came the first encounter. It was Clara who noticed it first, a flicker of movement between the trees. "Did you see that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Michael squinted into the shadows. At first he saw nothing, but then it appeared. A hunched figure, pale and lanky, with limbs that seemed too long for its body. Its eyes reflected the sunlight like an animal's, but they were disturbingly human in shape. Michael froze. He'd seen something like this before, not in real life, but in a survival horror game he'd played obsessively in high school. In the game, the creature was called the Stalker, a name that felt unnervingly appropriate now. "It's just an animal," Sam said, though he didn't sound convinced. The creature tilted its head in an almost curious manner before vanishing into the underbrush. The group stood in stunned silence, unsure of what to do. "We should go back to the car," Michael suggested, his voice tight. As they retraced their steps, the creature began to stalk them. They heard its footsteps, light but deliberate, trailing them from a distance. At one point, they came across a mutilated deer carcass, its ribs exposed like jagged branches. Clara gasped, and Jordan muttered a string of curses. By the time they made it back to the car, dusk was settling. Relief washed over them as Michael turned the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life, and they sped away. But the relief was short-lived. A mile down the road, the car shuddered to a stop. The engine was dead. Stranded, they decided to spend the night in a clearing they had passed earlier. The plan was simple: wait until morning, and then hike back to the gas station for help. They built a fire, its light casting long shadows across the trees. Michael found himself thinking about his family. His dad would have known exactly what to do in this situation. He'd always been calm under pressure. His mom, on the other hand, would have probably insisted they sing campfire songs to keep their spirits up. The thought made Michael's chest ache. The night was long and harrowing. They heard the creature circling their camp, its guttural growls sending shivers down their spines. At one point, it charged at the edge of the firelight, but retreated when Michael brandished a flaming branch. "I can't take this anymore," Clara whispered, her voice breaking. "We just need to make it till dawn," Michael replied, though he wasn't sure he believed it. When morning came, they set off toward the gas station, their nerves frayed, but their resolve unbroken. The creature didn't seem deterred by daylight. It continued to shadow them, visible in fleeting glimpses. The trail led them to a narrow river crossing. As they waded through the waist-deep water, the creature attacked. It lunged at Sam, dragging him under. Michael and Jordan fought to pull him free, but it was too late. Sam's screams echoed in Michael's ears as they stumbled onto the far bank. "We have to keep moving," Jordan said, his face pale and grim. Hours later, they reached the gas station, battered and terrified. The cashier was gone, but another car was parked outside. They begged the driver for help and piled into the back seat. As the car sped away, Michael looked out the window. The creature stood at the edge of the woods, watching them with those unblinking, reflective eyes. Michael leaned back, his body trembling. He knew he'd never forget what had happened in Pine Hollow. The creature wasn't just a story or a game. It was real, and it had taken one of his closest friends. As they left the town behind, Michael whispered a silent promise to himself. He would find out what the creature was, no matter how long it took. The Wendigo of Autumn Pines. Damian Rambo loved his hometown of Boulder, Colorado. Nestled against the breathtaking Flatirons, Boulder was a paradise for outdoor enthusiasts. Hiking, rock climbing, and mountain biking weren't just pastimes, they were a way of life. Damian had grown up exploring the rugged trails and dense woods surrounding the city, developing a love for nature. But for all its beauty, Boulder was also steeped in its share of ghost stories and eerie legends, something Damian had mostly dismissed. Now, in his early 20s, Damian was embarking on an autumn road trip with his closest friends, Ryan, Carla, and Ava. They were heading through the Rocky Mountain back roads toward a cabin they'd rented for a weekend getaway. The air was crisp, the leaves a kaleidoscope of red and gold, and the excitement of the open road made them all feel invincible. They hadn't planned on stopping in Autumn Pines, a tiny mountain town nestled in a shadowy valley, but when Ryan's car started sputtering, they had no choice. The single gas station looked as ancient as the town itself, with a faded wooden sign swinging on rusty hinges. Damian stayed by the car while Ryan went to talk to the attendant. Ava leaned against the hood, gazing at the surrounding forest. "This place feels off," she said. Carla laughed nervously. "Yeah, like it's stuck in time or something. Let's just get gas and go." Ryan came back, shaking his head. "The guy says we should stick around for a while. Apparently, the road ahead gets tricky after dark." "Great," Damian muttered, already uneasy. But they decided to take the advice, figuring it wouldn't hurt to rest and explore for a bit. The group wandered through Autumn Pines, its quaint charm tinged with an eerie stillness. The few locals they saw were reserved, watching them with wary eyes. Damian couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Late in the afternoon, they decided to hike a nearby trail that promised stunning views of the valley. The forest was dense and quiet, the only sounds coming from their crunching footsteps and the occasional caw of a crow. As they ventured deeper, the sense of unease grew stronger. Then they saw it. At first, Damian thought it was a trick of the light, a skeletal figure standing impossibly still between the trees. But as he focused, the details became horrifyingly clear. The creature was gaunt, its skin stretched tight over its bones, with elongated limbs and hollow, glowing eyes. Antlers jutted from its skull-like head, and its mouth was a jagged maw that seemed too wide. "What the hell is that?" Ava whispered, her voice barely audible. The creature moved, lurching forward with an unnatural gait. Damian's breath caught in his throat. He'd seen something like this before, not in real life, but in a survival horror game he'd played obsessively in high school. "A Wendigo! Run!" he shouted, snapping out of his paralysis. They bolted back toward the trailhead, the creature letting out a guttural scream that froze Damian's blood. He glanced back to see it bounding after them, faster than anything he'd ever seen. They made it back to the car, but the engine refused to start. Ryan frantically turned the key, but it was no use. The Wendigo was nowhere in sight, but they all knew it was still out there, watching. "Let's get to higher ground," Damian said, his voice shaking. "We can wait it out until morning." Carrying what supplies they could, they climbed a rocky incline and found a small clearing surrounded by thick trees. They built a fire, its crackling warmth providing little comfort against the oppressive darkness. Damian sat close to the flames, clutching a thick branch he'd fashioned into a makeshift weapon. As the hours dragged on, Damian's thoughts drifted to his family. His mom, a wildlife photographer, had always told him to respect the wilderness and its mysteries. His dad, a history buff, had once shared a story about the Wendigo, a cautionary tale from Native American folklore. Damian had laughed it off at the time, but now the memory sent chills down his spine. The Wendigo's cries echoed through the forest, each one closer than the last. The firelight danced on their terrified faces as they huddled together. I don't think it's afraid of the fire, Carla whispered, her voice trembling. Then we have to keep moving, Damien said, his jaw set. At first light, they descended the rocky slope and started toward the town. The forest seemed alive, every rustling leaf and snapping twig setting their nerves on edge. They were halfway to the gas station when the Wendigo attacked. It came from the shadows, its clawed hand snatching Ryan before anyone could react. He screamed as it dragged him into the underbrush. Damien and Ava tried to follow, but Carla pulled them back. "We can't fight it," she sobbed. Damien wanted to argue, but deep down, he knew she was right. The Wendigo was faster, stronger, and far more cunning than they could ever hope to be. By the time they stumbled into the gas station, they were battered and broken. The attendant was gone, but a trucker parked outside agreed to give them a ride. As they drove away, Damien stared out the window, his thoughts racing. The Wendigo had taken Ryan, and nothing would ever erase the horror of that night. As they left Autumn Pines behind, Damien vowed to learn everything he could about the creature. If it was real, there had to be a way to stop it. The memory of Ryan's screams haunted him, but so did a sliver of determination. The Wendigo was out there, and Damien wasn't going to let it win. Watcher in the Woods. Gina Smith had always considered herself a city girl. Growing up in Detroit, Michigan, her world was defined by the hum of car engines, the beat of Motown music, and the gritty yet vibrant energy of the Motor City. Detroit was a place of resilience, a city that had been knocked down time and time again, but always got back up. Gina loved its towering skyscrapers, its Art Deco architecture, and the endless expanse of urban life. But there was a part of her that longed for something quieter, something untouched by humanity. That's what brought her to the woods of Michigan's Upper Peninsula on a crisp October weekend. Her friend Cassie had convinced her to join a small group for a camping trip, promising it would be a refreshing escape from city life. The others were Cassie's boyfriend Tom and his younger brother Nate. Gina wasn't particularly close with the latter two, but she agreed, thinking the change of pace might do her good. The day had started out idyllic. The group arrived at Huron National Forest late in the morning, hiking to a remote campsite nestled deep in the woods. The trees were ablaze with autumn colors, fiery reds, burnt oranges, and golden yellows. The air was cool and crisp, carrying the earthy scent of fallen leaves. Gina found herself relaxing in the quiet, enjoying the sharp contrast to Detroit's bustling streets. By the time the sun began to set, they had set up camp near a small clearing. A fire crackled in the center, sending spirals of smoke into the darkening sky. Cassie and Tom were laughing over some inside joke, while Nate whittled a stick with a pocket knife. Gina sat quietly, sipping from a mug of hot cider and staring into the flames. That's when she noticed it, the silence. The woods, which had been alive with the sounds of chirping crickets and rustling leaves, had gone unnervingly still. Even the wind seemed to have vanished. Gina felt a prickle of unease crawl up her spine. "Do you hear that?" she asked. Cassie stopped laughing. "Hear what?" "Exactly," Gina replied. "It's quiet." The others exchanged uneasy glances. Tom shrugged it off. "Probably just a coyote nearby. They scare off smaller animals." Gina wasn't so sure. She had read about the myths of the Upper Peninsula, stories of strange creatures that roamed the woods, passed down by the region's indigenous peoples. One legend in particular came to mind, the Skinwalker. According to folklore, it was a malevolent being that could take on the appearance of animals or even humans, often stalking its prey before attacking. She pushed the thought aside, not wanting to seem paranoid. Later that evening, Gina wandered a short distance from the camp to gather more firewood. The others were preoccupied, and she needed some space to clear her head. As she bent to pick up a fallen branch, a chill ran through her. She had the unmistakable feeling of being watched. Slowly, she turned her head. There, just beyond the edge of her flashlight beam, was a figure. At first, she thought it was a trick of the light, a deer, perhaps. But as her eyes adjusted to the dim light, she realized it was something far worse. The creature stood partially hidden behind a tree, its emaciated body covered in mottled, pale skin. Its eyes glowed faintly, like two dull coals fixed unblinkingly on her. Gina's breath caught in her throat. She tried to convince herself it was a trick of the shadows, but the longer she stared, the more real it became. It didn't move, didn't make a sound. It just watched her. Her hand tightened around the flashlight, her pulse pounding in her ears. Without breaking eye contact, she began to back away, her boots crunching on the dry leaves. The creature tilted its head slightly, almost curiously, but didn't follow. Gina turned and ran, her heart hammering in her chest. Back at camp, she tried to explain what she'd seen. "It was watching me," she said, her voice trembling. "It wasn't an animal. It wasn't human." Tom looked skeptical. "You're probably just spooked. The woods can play tricks on you." "Gina doesn't scare easily," Cassie said, her expression serious. "If she says she saw something, we should listen." They decided to stay close to the fire for the rest of the night, their earlier laughter replaced by uneasy silence. Gina couldn't shake the image of the creature from her mind, its hollow eyes, its unnatural stillness. As the hours dragged on, the tension became unbearable. At one point, they heard rustling in the trees, followed by a low, guttural sound that sent chills down their spines. The creature was nearby. "We need to leave," Gina said, her voice firm. "Now." But the forest was vast, and the trails difficult to navigate in the dark. Without cell service and miles from the nearest town, they were effectively stranded. As dawn approached, they made their move, extinguishing the fire and packing up their gear as quickly as possible. Gina led the way, flashlight in hand, her every nerve on edge. The hike back to the main road was grueling. The creature stalked them the entire way, its pale form flickering in and out of sight among the trees. At one point, it lunged at Nate, its clawed hand grazing his shoulder. He screamed, stumbling forward as Tom and Gina pulled him away. "We're not going to make it," Nate gasped, his face pale. "Yes, we will," Gina snapped, refusing to give in to fear. Finally, after what felt like hours, they emerged onto the road. The sight of the empty asphalt brought tears to Gina's eyes. They flagged down a passing car, a lone trucker who didn't ask questions as they piled into the cab. As the truck rumbled away, Gina glanced back at the forest. For a brief moment, she thought she saw the creature standing at the tree line, its hollow eyes watching them. But then, it was gone, and the woods returned to their deceptive calm. Back in Detroit, Gina couldn't shake the events of that night. The city's familiar sounds and sights felt comforting, but the memory of the skinwalker lingered. She couldn't explain what she'd seen, but one thing was certain: she would never underestimate the woods again. The Winter Watcher. Chuck Stallone wasn't particularly fond of road trips, especially in winter, but when his old college friends pitched the idea of exploring the Appalachian Mountains, he reluctantly agreed. Chuck, a Denver native, was no stranger to snow-capped peaks and rugged terrain. Growing up at the foot of the Rockies, he had spent countless weekends skiing, hiking, and soaking in the crisp mountain air. Denver was a city of contradictions, bustling urban life surrounded by serene wilderness. It was a balance he loved. But the Appalachians? That was a different beast altogether. Older, more mysterious, with a history shrouded in eerie tales and folklore. The group consisted of Chuck, his best friend, Danny, Danny's girlfriend Liz, and a newcomer to their circle, Sam, a quiet guy who worked with Danny. The plan was simple: drive into the mountains, spend a day exploring, and head back before the roads got too icy. But plans, as Chuck would soon discover, had a way of unraveling. The snow began falling shortly after they arrived at their destination, a secluded trailhead deep in the Appalachian wilderness. The air was frigid, each breath forming a misty cloud as they trudged through the snow. The forest was dense, with towering pines and skeletal oaks stretching toward a leaden sky. Despite the biting cold, Chuck found himself marveling at the landscape. There was a stillness here, an ancient silence that felt both peaceful and unnerving. By late afternoon, the group reached a clearing with a partially frozen creek. They decided to set up a small fire and rest before heading back to their car. Chuck sat near the fire, flipping through the notes on his phone. Over the years, he had developed a fascination with cryptids, particularly Bigfoot. He had read countless reports of sightings in the Appalachians, fishermen glimpsing massive, hairy figures at the water's edge, hikers hearing guttural growls in the distance. It was easy to dismiss them as hoaxes, but standing here, surrounded by the vast, untamed wilderness, Chuck felt a flicker of doubt. "You really believe in that stuff?" Danny asked, catching a glimpse of Chuck's notes. "Not sure," Chuck admitted, "but there are enough stories to make you wonder." Liz rolled her eyes. "Stories are just that, stories. Besides, if Bigfoot's real, don't you think someone would have caught one by now?" Sam, who had been unusually quiet, spoke up. "Maybe it doesn't want to be found." The conversation ended there, replaced by the crackle of the fire and the occasional rustle of wind through the trees. But Chuck couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The first sign of trouble came as the sun dipped below the horizon. Liz had wandered a short distance to take photos of the creek when they heard her scream. Chuck and the others bolted toward the sound, finding her standing frozen, pointing at the tree line. "It was there," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Something huge, watching me." "What did it look like?" Chuck asked, his stomach tightening. Liz hesitated. "Like a man, but not. It was covered in hair, and its eyes, they were glowing." Danny laughed nervously. "You're probably just spooked. The shadows play tricks in the snow." But Chuck knew better. He scanned the forest, his eyes searching for movement, but the encroaching darkness revealed nothing. They decided to head back to the car before the situation could escalate. But as they packed up, Chuck spotted it, a massive figure lurking at the edge of the clearing. It was impossibly tall, its broad shoulders hunched, its body covered in dark, matted fur. The creature stepped forward, its glowing eyes fixed on the group. "Run!" Chuck shouted, grabbing Liz's arm as they bolted toward the trail. The creature didn't follow immediately, but its guttural growl echoed through the forest, chilling them to the bone. Snow began falling heavier, obscuring their path and making every step a struggle. By the time they reached the car, Sam was gone. They waited in the car, hoping Sam had somehow gotten ahead of them. Minutes turned into an hour, and the snowfall grew into a blizzard. They couldn't call the police. There was no signal this deep in the mountains. Chuck's mind raced with possibilities, but none of them ended well. The creature had taken Sam, of that he was certain. "We can't just sit here," Danny said. "We need to find him." "Are you insane?" Liz snapped. "It's out there. We can't leave him," Chuck interjected, grabbing a flashlight. "But we need a plan." They retraced their steps, calling Sam's name into the howling wind. The forest felt alive, its branches creaking and groaning under the weight of the snow. Chuck couldn't shake the feeling that the creature was hurting them, forcing them deeper into its territory. Hours later, they stumbled upon a small cave. Inside, they found Sam, alive but shaken. His jacket was torn, and his face was pale. "It took me," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "It dragged me here, but it left. I don't know why." Chuck didn't want to find out. They helped Sam to his feet and started back toward the car, but the creature wasn't done with them. It attacked as they crossed a narrow ridge, lunging from the shadows with terrifying speed. Danny shoved Liz out of the way, taking the brunt of the impact. The two went tumbling into the snow, disappearing into the darkness. Chuck shouted Danny's name, but there was no response, only the growls of the creature and the fading sound of the struggle. "Go!" Sam yelled, pulling Chuck and Liz forward. By dawn, they reached the car. The snowfall had finally stopped, revealing a pale, desolate landscape. Danny was gone, and the guilt weighed heavily on Chuck as they drove away. He glanced at the forest one last time, half expecting to see the creature watching them. But the woods were still, their secrets hidden once again. Back in Denver, Chuck couldn't stop thinking about that night. He avoided the articles and forums he once obsessed over, unable to face the reality of what he'd seen. The Rockies, once a source of comfort, now felt threatening, their vastness a reminder of the creature's domain. The Appalachians had left their mark on him, a scar he would carry for the rest of his life. The shadows of the spring forest. George Davidson loved the Midwest. Growing up in Wichita, Kansas, he was no stranger to open fields stretching endlessly under the vast sky. Wichita wasn't just home, it was where life felt simple. The bustling small-town atmosphere, the smell of wheat on the breeze, and the quiet nights made it easy to feel connected to the land. But as much as he loved his home, George craved adventure. The idea of towering forests, gushing rivers, and the unknown had always intrigued him. So when his friends proposed a spring camping trip to Michigan's Huron-Manistee National Forest, he jumped at the chance. The group consisted of George, his best friend Alex, Alex's girlfriend Jenny, and their mutual friend Carl. They planned to spend 3 days exploring the wilderness, fishing in the crystal-clear streams, and enjoying the beauty of the reborn spring forest. The first day was idyllic. The forest was alive with birdsong, the scent of blooming wildflowers, and the gentle rustle of fresh green leaves in the breeze. They set up camp in a clearing near a secluded lake, its surface shimmering under the midday sun. George felt a sense of calm he hadn't experienced in months. Wichita had been kind to him, but it lacked this feeling of being lost in something bigger than himself. As the day wore on, they fished, cooked their catch over the campfire, and laughed about old memories. That night, they sat around the fire, the crackling flames casting long shadows into the woods. George thought about his family, his mother's homemade pie during spring dinners, his dad teaching him to drive on those endless Kansas roads. It was a good life, but something about this moment felt irreplaceable. He was in the moment, and it felt perfect. But perfect doesn't last. The next evening, as twilight descended, George felt it first, a prickling sensation on the back of his neck. He scanned the tree line, half expecting to see a deer or maybe a fox. But the forest seemed unusually quiet, the lively chorus of birds and insects replaced by an oppressive silence. The others noticed it too. "Feels like something's watching us," Jenny said, her voice barely above a whisper. Alex laughed nervously. "Maybe it's a bear. They're waking up this time of year." George didn't respond. His mind wandered to the game he'd played a few months back, a survival horror title featuring Bigfoot as the antagonist. It was silly, he knew, but sitting here, surrounded by endless woods, it didn't seem so far-fetched. Later that night, as they sat around the fire, George caught the first glimpse. A shadow moved just beyond the firelight, impossibly large and deliberate. He froze, his breath caught in his throat. "Did you see that?" he whispered. "See what?" Alex asked. "Something big," George said. "Right over there." He pointed, but the shadow was gone. They stared into the darkness for what felt like an eternity, but nothing happened. Finally, they laughed it off and went to bed, chalking it up to George's imagination. But George didn't sleep well. The faint rustling outside the tent kept him awake, and every time he closed his eyes, he felt the same prickling unease. The following morning, Carl was gone. They found his tent ripped open, his belongings scattered. His phone and boots were missing, but there were no signs of a struggle, just deep, heavy footprints leading into the woods. "We need to find him," Jenny said, panic creeping into her voice. "We stick together," George said firmly. "No splitting up." They packed their essentials and followed the tracks, their hearts pounding. The forest, which had seemed so inviting yesterday, now felt suffocating. The sunlight barely penetrated the thick canopy, and every sound, the snap of a twig, the rustle of leaves, made them jump. Hours later, they found Carl's phone near a creek. The screen was cracked, but it still worked. The last photo he had taken sent chills down George's spine. It was blurry, but unmistakable. A hulking figure covered in dark, matted hair, its face obscured but its massive frame dominating the frame. "We need to leave," Jenny said, her voice trembling. George nodded. "We'll head back to the car and get help." The way back was a nightmare. The creature was stalking them. Its guttural growls echoed through the forest, growing closer with each passing hour. At one point, Alex tripped on a root, and George had to pull him up before the creature closed the gap. As night fell, they were forced to stop. Exhausted and terrified, they built a fire and sat huddled together, their backs to the flames. The creature prowled the perimeter, its glowing eyes reflecting the firelight. It didn't attack, but its presence was enough to keep them on edge. George thought about his family again, his mom's laughter, his dad's steady voice. He wondered if he'd ever see them again. The fear was almost too much to bear, but he forced himself to stay calm. "We'll get out of this," he said, more to himself than anyone else. At dawn, they made their move, abandoning anything that would slow them down. The creature chased them, its massive strides shaking the ground. Jenny was the first to falter, but Alex and George pulled her along, refusing to leave her behind. When they finally reached the car, it was like a miracle. They piled in, George slamming the gas pedal to the floor. In the rearview mirror, he saw the creature standing at the edge of the forest, its massive form silhouetted against the rising sun. It didn't follow. Back in Wichita, George couldn't stop thinking about the trip. Carl was still missing, and the police had found no evidence of the creature. But George knew what he'd seen. The woods had their secrets, and Bigfoot was one of them. He vowed never to return, but the memory would haunt him forever.
Chuck Calhoun loved the solitude of the hunt. Growing up in Seattle, Washington, he had spent countless weekends hiking through the misty forests of the Pacific Northwest, his boots crunching over mossy trails. Seattle's rain-washed skyline and evergreen wilderness were part of his soul, and while the constant drizzle often kept others indoors, it gave Chuck a sense of peace. His family joked that he was half man, half cedar tree. So, when his old friend Marcus invited him on a hunting trip in New York's Adirondack Mountains, Chuck was eager to trade one forest for another. He flew across the country, carrying only his rifle and a small pack of essentials. The plan was simple: spend a day tracking deer, enjoy the crisp autumn air, and maybe come home with a trophy. The forest was strikingly beautiful. Red and gold leaves blanketed the ground, and a gentle rain pattered against the canopy, creating a symphony of sound. The air smelled earthy and rich, and the occasional burst of sunlight through the clouds cast long shadows on the damp ground. By late afternoon, Chuck and Marcus had wandered far from their truck, their boots slick with mud. The forest was unusually quiet, though neither of them remarked on it at first. They'd seen a few signs of deer, broken branches, fresh tracks, but no luck so far. The quiet wasn't entirely unpleasant. It reminded Chuck of the stillness after a heavy Seattle rain, the kind that made the world feel freshly washed. "Let's set up camp here," Marcus said, gesturing to a small clearing. "We'll pick up the trail again tomorrow morning." They built a small fire, more for comfort than warmth. The drizzle had lessened, but the air was cold, and the flames cast flickering shadows on the trees. Chuck leaned back against a fallen log, thinking about his family. He pictured his dad teaching him to clean his first fish on the docks of Puget Sound, his mom pulling fresh loaves of bread from the oven, the kitchen filled with warmth on rainy days. Those memories made him smile. As the fire burned lower, Chuck thought back to the YouTube videos he'd watched before the trip. Cryptid stories fascinated him, accounts of strange creatures lurking in the woods. He'd seen everything from supposed Bigfoot sightings to grainy footage of unidentified creatures moving unnaturally fast. It was entertainment, nothing more. But here in the middle of nowhere, the idea felt less far-fetched. A snapping branch broke the silence. Both men froze. "What was that?" Marcus asked, his voice low. Chuck's eyes scanned the darkness beyond the firelight. "Probably a deer," he said, but the words sounded unconvincing, even to himself. The noise came again, closer this time, a deliberate, heavy step. Chuck reached for his rifle, his heart pounding. The firelight didn't penetrate far into the trees, but he caught a glimpse of something. Eyes. Reflective, unblinking, and too high off the ground to belong to a deer. "Do you see that?" Chuck whispered. "Yeah," Marcus said. "What the hell is it?" The eyes disappeared, and the forest fell silent again. The men didn't move for what felt like an eternity, staring into the blackness. Then a sound came, a guttural, low growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. "Whatever it is, it's big," Marcus said, his voice shaking. Before they could react, the creature attacked. It moved with terrifying speed, crashing through the undergrowth toward them. Chuck barely had time to raise his rifle before Marcus was thrown backward, disappearing into the trees. Chuck fired blindly, the muzzle flash illuminating the creature for a split second. Its form was hulking, humanoid but wrong, with elongated limbs and a featureless face. Then it was gone, the forest swallowing it whole. He scrambled to his feet, shouting Marcus's name, but there was no answer. The fire had been scattered in the chaos, and the clearing was plunged into near-total darkness. Chuck knew he couldn't stay. Grabbing his pack and rifle, he headed toward the truck. The rain had picked up again, soaking his clothes and making the ground slippery. His flashlight flickered, the beam cutting through the downpour but revealing nothing beyond the trees. The forest felt alive, every shadow and rustle threatening to reveal the creature. He could hear it pacing him, count its heavy steps mirroring his own. The rain muffled the sounds, but the occasional growl reminded him it was still there. Hours later, Chuck found a small overhang of rock and lit a makeshift fire. He had no choice but to stop. His legs were trembling from exhaustion, and he couldn't navigate the forest in complete darkness. The creature stayed just out of sight, its presence a constant weight on his mind. Chuck's thoughts drifted to his family again. His sister's infectious laugh, his dad's calm demeanor. Would they ever know what happened to him? Would he become one of those stories on YouTube? A cryptid victim, his disappearance chalked up to the wilderness? Morning came slowly, the rain easing but the cold biting. Chuck forced himself to keep moving, following the faint trail back to the truck. The creature attacked again, just as he reached the edge of the forest, lunging from the trees with a bone-chilling scream. Chuck fired his last shot, and the creature retreated, injured but not defeated. He didn't stop running until he reached the truck. Marcus's gear was still there, but his friend was gone. Chuck drove to the nearest town, his hands trembling on the wheel. He didn't call the police. What could he say? That something inhuman had taken his friend? Back in Seattle, Chuck couldn't shake the memory of those reflective eyes. He stopped watching cryptid videos. They weren't entertaining anymore. The forest held secrets, and he'd come too close to one. David Rambo had always loved the raw beauty of nature. Growing up in Detroit, Michigan, a city known for its industrial heart and vibrant music scene, David often found solace in the outdoors. The bustling streets of Detroit, the hum of car engines, and the rhythm of Motown were a stark contrast to the quiet, expansive wilderness he craved. As a kid, his family had taken trips to the nearby forests, where he learned to track animals and identify different bird calls. These memories stuck with him, instilling a passion for hunting and exploration. When his cousin James suggested a hunting trip in the dense swamps of Louisiana, David jumped at the opportunity. The plan was to spend a few days in the bayou, hunting wild boar and enjoying the humid, untamed wilderness. David packed light, but made sure to include a rifle, a sturdy knife, and a copy of Cryptids Quarterly, a magazine he had picked up at the airport. The latest issue had an article on skinwalkers, creatures from Navajo folklore. It was a chilling read, but David dismissed it as fanciful writing, fiction meant to entertain. The group consisted of David, James, and two other friends, Robert and Kyle. They drove deep into the bayou, their truck bouncing along uneven dirt roads. The air was thick with the scent of moss and stagnant water, and the sound of cicadas created a constant, buzzing background. Summer rains had left the ground soft and muddy, and the dense canopy above offered little relief from the heat. By their second day, the group had ventured deep into the swamp, far from any signs of civilization. The area was eerily quiet, with only the occasional rustle of leaves or splash of water to break the stillness. That evening, they set up camp in a small clearing, surrounded by cypress trees draped with Spanish moss. A light rain began to fall, pattering against the tarp they had strung up for cover. The fire crackled weakly in the damp air, casting flickering shadows across their makeshift camp. As they sat around the fire, trading stories and passing a flask of whiskey, David couldn't help but feel uneasy. The swamp was beautiful, but oppressive, its silence too heavy. He glanced at the magazine in his bag, recalling the descriptions of the skinwalker, its ability to mimic voices, its unnatural speed and strength. He shook off the thought, reminding himself it was just a story. The first sign of trouble came when they heard a splash nearby, followed by a low, guttural sound. "Probably a gator," James said, though his voice lacked confidence. David stood and scanned the darkness with his flashlight, the beam cutting through the rain. Something moved just beyond its reach, a quick, shadowy blur. "Did you see that?" David asked, his heart pounding. "Yeah," Kyle said, gripping his rifle tightly. "It's probably nothing, right?" The group fell silent, straining to hear over the rain and the crackling fire. Then came a sound that made David's blood run cold, a voice, soft and pleading. "Help me!" It was faint but unmistakable, coming from the direction of the swamp. "Who's there?" Robert called out, his voice trembling. No answer, just the sound of movement. Closer now. David's flashlight caught a glimpse of something. Eyes reflecting in the darkness, too far apart and too high off the ground to belong to any human or animal they knew. The creature didn't wait for them to react. It lunged from the shadows, its shape shifting in the firelight. Long limbs, twisted features, and a terrifying, unnatural gait. The group scattered as it tore through the campsite, its speed overwhelming. David fired his rifle, the deafening shot echoing through the swamp. The creature shrieked and retreated, but not before grabbing Kyle and dragging him into the darkness. His screams were cut off abruptly, leaving the others frozen in horror. "We need to move now," James shouted, snapping David out of his stupor. Grabbing what gear they could, the remaining three men plunged into the swamp, guided only by the faint beam of their flashlights. The rain intensified, turning the ground into a treacherous mess of mud and water. They moved as fast as they could, but the creature was never far behind. Its guttural growls and rustling movements kept them on edge, forcing them to stop and listen every few minutes. They found a small patch of dry ground and lit a fire, hoping the flames would keep the creature at bay. Sitting in the dim light, soaked to the bone, David's mind raced. He thought of his family back in Detroit, his mother's warm smile, his father's quiet strength, and the way his younger sister teased him about his obsession with cryptids. He wondered if he'd ever see them again. Robert broke the silence. "What the hell is that thing?" It's not possible." David shook his head. "I don't know, but it's hunting us." Morning came slowly, the rain easing to a drizzle. Exhausted but determined, they pressed on, using a GPS to navigate toward their truck. The swamp seemed to stretch endlessly, every tree and shadow looking the same. When they finally reached the edge of the swamp, the creature attacked again, appearing out of nowhere. It lunged at Robert, its claws tearing into him before David managed to fire a shot that drove it back. Robert was badly injured, and they had to carry him the rest of the way. They reached the truck just as the sun broke through the clouds, the swamp bathed in an eerie, golden light. David and James loaded Robert into the back seat and sped toward the nearest town, their hearts racing. They debated calling the police, but decided against it. What could they say? Who would believe them? Back in Detroit, David couldn't shake the memory of that night. He stopped reading Cryptids Quarterly and avoided any mention of skinwalkers. The swamp had taken something from him, more than just a friend. It had taken his sense of safety, leaving him with the haunting realization that some stories were better left unread. Robert Smith was used to the open plains of Wichita, Kansas, where the land stretched endlessly under wide skies and the winters were biting but familiar. A quiet life in Wichita was a comforting rhythm of predictability. Friday nights at the local diner, weekend bonfires with family, and the annual ice fishing trips with his childhood friends. But this year was different. His friend Chris had suggested they venture further out to the Ozark Mountains. Pristine waters, untouched wilderness, Chris had promised. Robert agreed, intrigued by the promise of adventure. The group, Robert, Chris, Ethan, and Mark, set out early one January morning. Their truck was packed with gear: ice augers, fishing rods, coolers, and enough provisions for a few days. The Ozarks, with their rugged peaks and sprawling woods, were a stark contrast to the open expanse of Kansas. As they drove deeper into the mountains, Robert noticed how the sunlight barely broke through the dense canopy of leafless trees, casting long shadows over the winding roads. The first day was uneventful but serene. They set up camp near a frozen lake, the sun glinting off the ice in a way that made the entire scene look like a postcard. The crisp air carried the faint smell of pine, and the occasional sound of a woodpecker echoed through the stillness. They drilled holes in the ice and spent the day fishing, their laughter cutting through the otherwise silent woods. By nightfall, they had caught enough fish for dinner and sat around a roaring fire, telling stories and trading jokes. It was around this fire that Robert's thoughts drifted to his family back in Wichita. His mother's habit of baking pies on cold afternoons, his father teaching him to bait hooks on lazy summer days by the Arkansas River. He smiled at the memory and thought of how they'd react to tales of the rugged Ozarks. The nostalgia was interrupted by Ethan, who brought up the local legends. "Ever hear about the Ozark Howler?" Ethan asked, his grin mischievous. "They say it's like a wolf, but bigger, smarter. Some kind of werewolf." Chris rolled his eyes. "Come on, man, we're not kids anymore." "I'm just saying," Ethan replied. "People have seen things out here. There are stories." Robert listened, remembering the articles he had read before the trip. Reports of strange howls, claw marks on trees too high for any bear, and glimpses of shadowy figures. He had dismissed it as folklore, much like the tales of Bigfoot or skinwalkers he had indulged in during late-night online rabbit holes. The fire burned low, and the group eventually drifted to their tents. The clear night sky glittered with stars, and the air was so cold it seemed to bite at their exposed skin. Robert woke in the middle of the night to a sound, low and guttural like a growl. He sat up, heart pounding, and strained his ears. Another sound followed, this one closer, a heavy, deliberate crunch of snow. "Chris?" Robert whispered, unzipping his tent. He emerged to find Chris and Mark standing near the fire pit, rifles in hand. "You hear that too?" Chris asked, his voice tight. Before Robert could answer, a howl ripped through the stillness, unlike anything he'd ever heard. It was deep, resonant, and carried a primal rage. The sound seemed to come from every direction at once. The others joined them, wide-eyed and shivering. Then they saw it. The creature was enormous, its dark fur glinting in the moonlight. It stood on two legs but moved with a fluidity that was disturbingly animalistic. Its eyes glowed a sickly yellow, and its claws were long enough to gleam like knives. The group froze as it stepped closer, snarling. "Run!" Chris shouted, firing a shot. The gunshot echoed through the mountains, and the creature lunged. Chaos erupted as the group scattered into the woods, their flashlights bouncing wildly in the dark. Robert's breath came in ragged gasps as he sprinted through the snow, the sound of snapping branches and growls behind him. He could hear Ethan scream, but he didn't dare look back. Eventually, Robert and Chris regrouped near a rocky outcrop. Mark was with them, his face pale and his hands shaking. Ethan was nowhere to be seen. "We can't stay here," Robert said, his voice hoarse. "We don't know where it is," Chris replied. "We have to find some kind of shelter." They stumbled upon a shallow cave and built a small fire, huddling close. The flames danced weakly, barely illuminating the space. The creature's howls echoed in the distance, each one sending a jolt of fear through Robert. They spoke in hushed tones, speculating about what it was and how they'd survive until morning. Robert's thoughts drifted again, this time to his younger brother back in Wichita. He remembered teaching him to ride a bike, and the way he'd look up to him with unwavering trust. He wondered if he'd ever make it home to see him again. The night dragged on, each minute feeling like an hour. When dawn finally came, they emerged from the cave cautiously, the cold sunlight offering little comfort. They followed the faint trail back to the lake, desperate to reach the truck. The woods were eerily quiet, the only sound their boots crunching in the snow. As they neared the edge of the forest, the creature attacked again. It leaped from the trees, its claws slashing at Mark before Chris managed to fire a shot that sent it retreating. Mark was gravely injured, and they had to carry him the rest of the way. When they finally reached the truck, they loaded Mark into the back and sped toward the nearest town. Their faces were pale, their hands trembling on the wheel. They debated calling the police, but decided against it. What could they say? That a werewolf had attacked them? Back in Wichita, Robert couldn't shake the memory of that night. He stopped reading about cryptids and avoided trips to remote areas. The Ozarks had taken something from him. Ethan, a friend, and a piece of his courage. Some stories, he realized, were better left as legends. Nick Calhoun had spent most of his life in Lawrence, Kansas, a town nestled in the rolling hills and endless fields of the Midwest. Known for its college town charm and fiery sunsets, Lawrence was a place of familiar faces and comforting predictability. Nick grew up with stories of local hauntings and mysterious happenings told around bonfires, but they never fazed him. After all, Kansas wasn't the kind of place for monsters, just tornadoes and the occasional ghost story. Wyoming, though, was different. It was wilder, untamed, and vast in a way Kansas wasn't. The land stretched out under a sky so big it made you feel small. Nick was driving through this alien landscape on his way to meet an old friend in Montana. His beat-up truck rattled as he pulled into a lonely gas station off a dusty two-lane highway. It was mid-afternoon, but thick clouds hung low, threatening rain. A crooked wooden sign reading "Last Stop for 50 miles" creaked in the breeze. The gas station was more run-down than he'd expected, with peeling paint and a flickering neon "Open" sign. He filled up the truck, then headed inside to grab a drink. The place smelled of motor oil and mildew. An old man sat behind the counter, watching a static-filled TV. He barely acknowledged Nick, except to mutter, "Storm's coming. Be careful out there." Nick nodded politely, paid for his drink, and headed back to his truck. But as he was about to drive off, he saw something, or thought he did. Movement, just out of the corner of his eye, near the tree line beyond the station. It was too quick to make out, but it didn't move like a deer or a person. Something about it unsettled him. Shrugging it off, he drove another few miles before deciding to pull over at a picnic area to stretch his legs. The place was empty except for a few faded picnic tables and a small fire pit surrounded by weeds. He figured it would be a good spot to relax before the next long stretch of road. The air was heavy with the smell of wet earth, and the breeze whispered through the trees. As Nick sipped his soda, the feeling returned, that sense of being watched. He scanned the woods, the cloudy sky above casting an eerie gray light over everything, and then he saw them. Eyes, reflective and too high off the ground, watching him from the shadows. Nick froze. His mind flashed back to stories he'd overheard as a kid, tales of creatures that could mimic voices and appearances. Skinwalkers, the older kids had called them. He'd always laughed it off, dismissing it as just another campfire story meant to spook little kids. But now, standing alone in the Wyoming wilderness, he wasn't laughing. The eyes disappeared, and for a moment, everything was still. Then came the sound, a rustle in the bushes, deliberate and heavy. He grabbed a stick from the fire pit, its charred end still sharp. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. "Who's there?" he called, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. No answer, just silence. Suddenly, a voice called back, his voice. "Who's there?" Nick's blood ran cold. It wasn't an echo. It was a perfect mimic coming from the woods. He backed toward his truck, keeping his eyes on the tree line. The rustling grew louder, and then it stepped out. The creature looked almost human, but its movements were all wrong, jerky, unnatural. Its skin was pale and stretched tight over elongated limbs, and its face was featureless except for those glowing, reflective eyes. Nick didn't wait. He bolted for the truck, heart pounding as the creature let out an unearthly screech. He threw open the door and started the engine, tires kicking up gravel as he sped back toward the highway. In his rearview mirror, he saw it give chase, faster than anything he'd ever seen. The road twisted through a wooded canyon, and Nick struggled to keep the truck steady on the slick pavement. The creature didn't relent, its hulking form weaving through the trees like a predator honing in on its prey. At one point, it got close enough to slam into the back of the truck, the impact jolting him forward. He gripped the wheel tighter, cursing under his breath. Ahead, he spotted a small clearing with an old campsite. With no other option, he swerved off the road and skidded to a stop. Grabbing a road flare from under the seat, he jumped out and lit it, the red glow illuminating the darkening woods. The creature stopped just at the edge of the clearing, its eyes fixed on him. It didn't like the fire. He could see it hesitate, pacing the tree line. Nick kept the flare high, circling slowly to keep it between himself and the creature. As he stood there, his thoughts drifted to his younger sister back in Lawrence. She used to tease him for being the cautious one, always double-checking locks and insisting on plans. He'd call her as soon as this was over, assuming he survived. The standoff lasted what felt like hours, but eventually the creature retreated into the shadows. Nick didn't wait to see if it was gone for good. He threw the flare into the fire pit, watching it ignite into a small blaze, then sprinted back to the truck. He drove non-stop until he reached the next town, a speck on the map with a diner and a motel. The waitress at the counter raised an eyebrow when he stumbled in, wild-eyed and covered in dirt. "Long drive?" she asked. "Yeah," Nick replied, forcing a weak smile. Something like that. He didn't tell anyone what had happened. Who would believe him? As he lay in the motel bed that night, the creature's eyes haunted his dreams. Wyoming had given him something he never thought he'd find. Proof that some stories aren't just stories. David Davidson had never been one to shy away from adventure. Growing up in the rugged expanses of West Texas, he'd spent countless weekends hiking through the arid canyons and camping under the infinite starlit sky. Texas was a land of extremes. Scorching summers, wild storms, and a landscape that seemed to stretch forever. It was familiar, almost comforting in its vastness. But the Northeast was different. New York State's dense, shadowy forests, moss-covered boulders, and tangled undergrowth were foreign and intriguing. When a friend recommended a solo camping trip to the Catskills, David couldn't resist. "Perfect for unwinding," the friend had said. David packed light, his trusty tent, a few provisions, and a well-worn camping knife, and drove out on a crisp, sunny April morning. By mid-afternoon, David had found an ideal spot to pitch his tent near a secluded clearing by a babbling creek. The air was cool, carrying the earthy scent of damp leaves and wildflowers. Birds chirped overhead, and the sunlight filtered through the canopy, casting dappled patterns on the ground. It was perfect. Almost too perfect. David spent the day exploring the area, marveling at the lush greenery and towering maples. The solitude was a welcome escape from his busy life back in Texas. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in soft oranges and purples, he built a small fire and cooked dinner, savoring the serenity. It wasn't until the fire began to die down that he felt it, the unmistakable sensation of being watched. At first, he dismissed it as nerves. After all, he was deep in unfamiliar woods, alone for the first time in months. But then he heard it, a faint rustling in the underbrush, too deliberate to be the wind. His heart quickened as he scanned the darkness beyond the firelight. The rustling stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. "Probably just an animal," he muttered, trying to convince himself, but the feeling of unease lingered. Then he saw it. Just beyond the glow of the fire, a shadow moved, too large to be a deer, too fluid to be human. The figure paused, crouching low as if studying him. For a brief moment, the flickering firelight caught its eyes, gleaming, reflective and unblinking. David froze, Every muscle in his body tensed. The creature moved again, slinking silently into the trees. David's mind raced. Was it a bear? A wolf? No, it didn't move like either. He remembered the whispers he'd overheard while preparing for the trip, rumors of strange sightings in the Catskills. Unidentified, they called it. Some claimed it was an undiscovered predator. Others swore it wasn't of this world. He'd laughed it off at the time, but now his skepticism wavered. Clutching his knife, David stoked the fire, its renewed warmth chasing away the shadows. He stayed up for hours, his ears straining for any sound, but the creature didn't return. Eventually, exhaustion overtook him, and he dozed off in his tent. He woke abruptly to the sound of something heavy crashing through the woods. The fire had gone out, leaving only smoldering embers. Grabbing his flashlight, David stepped outside, his breath visible in the chilly night air. The noise was coming closer, accompanied by low, guttural growls that sent chills down his spine. Suddenly, the creature burst into the clearing. It was unlike anything David had ever seen. Tall and gaunt, with limbs too long and joints bent at unnatural angles. Its skin was a mottled gray, stretched tight over a skeletal frame, and its eyes, those terrible glowing eyes, locked onto him with predatory intent. David bolted, adrenaline propelling him into the woods. Branches clawed at his face and arms as he ran, the creature's guttural snarls echoing behind him. He tripped over a root and tumbled to the ground, scrambling to his feet just in time to see the thing leap at him. He swung his knife wildly, the blade catching its side. It howled, a sound so piercing it seemed to vibrate in his bones, then disappeared into the darkness. Breathing heavily, David stumbled back toward his campsite. He knew he couldn't stay there. Grabbing his pack, he extinguished the last of the fire and started down the trail toward his truck, the knife still clenched in his hand. The hike was treacherous in the dark, the flashlight casting shaky beams of light ahead. The creature was never far, its glowing eyes occasionally visible in the distance. David's mind wandered to his parents back in Texas, their unshakable faith in his resourcefulness. "You've always been a survivor," his dad had once told him. He clung to those words now. Hours passed in a blur of fear and determination. The sun began to rise, its pale light pushing back the shadows. David finally reached his truck, his legs weak and his hands trembling. As he climbed into the cab, he spotted a smear of dark, oily blood on his knife. Proof that whatever it wasn't invincible. He sped down the gravel road toward the nearest town, dialing 911 as soon as he had cell service. The operator listened as he recounted his experience, but her response was frustratingly neutral. "We'll send someone to check the area," she said. He knew she didn't believe him. Back in Texas, David couldn't shake the experience. He avoided camping trips and woods altogether. The creature hadn't just attacked him. It had left a mark, a lingering unease that wouldn't fade. He didn't care if anyone believed his story. He knew the truth, and that was enough. Some places, he realized, weren't meant for people. Chuck Davidson adjusted his cap as he leaned against the truck, taking in the fresh air of the Ozark Mountains. He had driven up with his two longtime friends, Dale and Mickey, looking for a change of scenery from the flat, arid expanses of Texas. Chuck's hometown, Lubbock, was the kind of place where dust storms were as much a part of life as high school football. The idea of lush, green woods and pristine mountain lakes was too tempting to pass up. The trio had arrived early in the morning, their truck loaded with fishing gear, coolers, and enough supplies for 3 days. The air was calm, the sky a pale blue streaked with high clouds. The mountains loomed around them, cradling the lake like a secret tucked away from the world. The three friends set up camp near the water's edge, their laughter and easy camaraderie filling the quiet space. The first day was idyllic. They spent hours casting their lines into the lake, pulling up bass and trout with satisfying regularity. Dale told jokes that had them doubling over with laughter, while Mickey kept busy showing off his expert casting techniques, which mostly resulted in tangles. Chuck, ever the steady one, just enjoyed the stillness of it all, the kind of quiet he hadn't realized he'd been missing. That night, they built a fire and cooked their catch, savoring the flaky fish and the warmth of the flames against the cooling night. But as the fire began to die down, a strange stillness settled over the area. Chuck noticed it first, the absence of crickets, frogs, or any of the usual nocturnal sounds. It was as if the woods were holding their breath. "You hear that?" he asked, breaking the silence. "Hear what?" Mickey replied, tossing another log onto the fire. "Exactly," Chuck said, scanning the darkened tree line. His voice was low, and there was a tension to it that made the other two pause. Before they could comment, there was a rustling in the underbrush. Dale froze, his hand gripping the handle of the hatchet he'd been using to split kindling. The rustling grew louder, then stopped. A pair of faintly glowing eyes appeared in the darkness, low to the ground and unblinking. "What the hell is that?" Mickey whispered. Chuck felt his stomach tighten. He'd read stories online about the Rougarou, an elusive, werewolf-like creature rumored to haunt places like the Ozarks. Most dismissed it as a tall tale to scare campers and hunters. Chuck had laughed at those stories, but now, staring into those glowing eyes, he wasn't so sure. The figure moved, slinking into the shadows with an eerie silence. Chuck felt his heart hammering in his chest as he strained his ears. The silence dragged on, oppressive and unnatural, until a sudden, guttural growl erupted from the darkness. "Get in the truck!" Chuck yelled. The three of them bolted toward the vehicle, abandoning the fire. As they ran, Chuck heard the heavy thud of something large moving through the undergrowth behind them. They reached the truck and scrambled inside, locking the doors. Mickey fumbled for the keys, his hands shaking as he tried to start the engine. The headlights clicked on, illuminating the forest ahead and the creature. It stood upright now, its gaunt, muscular frame towering over the hood of the truck. Its face was twisted, somewhere between human and animal, with long, matted fur and unnaturally large claws. Chuck saw a flash of its teeth, sharp and yellowed, before it let out a deafening roar and charged the truck. The windshield cracked under the force of its claws, and Mickey floored the gas. The truck lurched forward, throwing the creature off balance, but not before one of its claws slashed through the open side window, catching Dale's arm. Dale cried out in pain, clutching the wound as blood seeped through his fingers. They sped down the dirt road, the creature's snarls fading into the distance. Chuck turned to check on Dale, tearing strips from his shirt to wrap the wound. "It's not too deep," Chuck said, though his voice betrayed his fear. The drive back toward town was harrowing. The dirt road twisted through dense woods, and the sense of being pursued never left them. The truck's radio had no signal, and their phones were useless this far into the mountains. They debated whether to stop and make camp, but Dale's injury was growing worse, and the chances of navigating the rugged terrain in the dark were slim. Eventually, they found a small clearing and built another fire, more out of desperation than confidence. Chuck kept his knife at his side, his eyes scanning the darkness. The calm of earlier that day seemed like a distant memory now. Mickey tried to lighten the mood with a story about a fishing trip gone wrong, but the tension was palpable. Chuck's thoughts drifted to his younger sister back home. He remembered teaching her how to fish at the lake near their house, her laughter ringing out as she reeled in her first catch. He wondered if he'd ever hear that laugh again. The hours dragged on, the fire crackling as the only sound. At one point, Chuck thought he saw those glowing eyes again, but they disappeared as quickly as they'd appeared. None of them slept, and when the first light of dawn filtered through the trees, they packed up and continued toward town. The creature struck again, just as they reached the main road. It leaped from the trees, slamming into the side of the truck. Mickey swerved, nearly hitting a tree, but kept the truck moving. Chuck grabbed the rifle they kept under the seat and fired a shot out the window. The creature let out another piercing roar and disappeared into the woods. When they finally reached the edge of the town, they called the police. An officer took their statement, but it was clear he didn't believe them. "Probably a bear," he said, scribbling in his notebook. Chuck didn't bother arguing. Back in Texas, Chuck couldn't shake the memory of that night. The Rougarou, or whatever it was, had left more than a physical mark on Dale's arm. It had left a scar on all of them, a reminder of the thin line between legend and reality. Chuck didn't need anyone to believe his story. He knew what he'd seen, and he had no intention of ever going back to the Ozarks. A hunting trip in the Appalachians. The autumn air was crisp and dry, carrying the faint scent of fallen leaves and pine. Damian Russell adjusted the straps of his hunting pack and glanced at his friends. Brandon, the self-proclaimed expert, was ahead, leading the way through the dense Appalachian forest. Behind him were Alex, a quiet but reliable friend, and Nate, who brought the group's humor with his endless commentary. Damian, originally from Denver, wasn't a stranger to the outdoors. Growing up in the shadow of the Rocky Mountains, he had spent countless weekends hiking trails and learning to track game with his father. But the Appalachians felt different. These woods were ancient, steeped in a kind of mystery the Rockies lacked. They had set up camp near a clearing the night before. The fire had been warm, the jokes plentiful, and the stars brighter than Damian had seen in years. They were here for deer, hoping to stock up on meat before the long winter months. The morning had been productive, with Alex spotting a herd in the distance, and the group deciding to track it deeper into the woods. By mid-afternoon, they were miles from camp, trudging through a sunlit forest where golden leaves danced in the gentle breeze. Damian noticed how unnervingly quiet it had become. The cheerful songs of birds had vanished, replaced by an oppressive silence. Even the crunch of leaves underfoot felt too loud. "You notice how quiet it is?" Damian asked, breaking the silence. Brandon shrugged. "It's just the forest. Animals sense us and clear out." But Damian wasn't convinced. He had spent enough time outdoors to know the difference between natural quiet and something else. A feeling tugged at the edge of his senses, a primal instinct he couldn't shake. The first sign came as they were crossing a small ridge. Nate was the first to see it, an animal carcass, torn and mangled, lying half buried in the leaves. It was too mutilated to identify, but the deep claw marks across its body were unmistakable. "Bear?" Alex guessed, his voice unsure. Brandon knelt by the remains, frowning. "Bears don't usually leave something like this. They'd eat more of it." Damian's unease grew. He'd heard stories about strange creatures in these woods, passed down in whispers from one hunter to another. The Skinwalker, a malevolent being from Native American folklore, was the most persistent tale. He had never believed in such things, but now, staring at the shredded remains, he wasn't so sure. They pressed on, the mood more subdued. The forest seemed to close in around them, the trees casting long shadows despite the bright sun above. Every crack of a branch or rustle of leaves set their nerves on edge. It happened just before dusk. They had paused in a small glade to rest, sitting on fallen logs and sipping from their water bottles. Damian was scanning the tree line when he saw it, a shadow moving too quickly to be natural. It darted between the trees, vanishing as soon as he focused on it. "Did you see that?" he asked, standing abruptly. "See what?" Nate replied, looking up from his phone where he was checking the GPS. Something big, over there." Before anyone could respond, the air was split by a guttural scream, raw and primal. It echoed through the trees, freezing them in place. A moment later, the shadow reappeared, closer this time. It stepped into view, a figure crouched low, its limbs elongated and moving unnaturally. Its skin was pale and stretched tight over its bones, and its eyes gleamed with a malevolence that froze Damian's blood. Brandon raised his rifle and fired. The shot rang out, shattering the silence, but the creature moved faster than anything humanly possible. It disappeared into the trees, the echo of its scream lingering. "We need to go," Damian said, his voice shaking. As they started back toward camp, the creature struck. It was on Nate before anyone could react, its claws slicing through his back. He screamed, collapsing to the ground as the others fired wildly into the forest. The creature vanished again, leaving only silence and Nate's shallow breaths. They carried Nate as best they could, stumbling through the woods as the sun dipped below the horizon. Darkness fell quickly, the temperature dropping with it. They had no choice but to stop and build a fire, the light their only protection against the things stalking them. Sitting around the flames, Damien's thoughts drifted to his family. He thought of his younger brother, who had always looked up to him, and his mother's warm smile whenever he came home from a trip. He wondered if he'd see them again. Brandon kept his rifle trained on the darkness, his face pale and drawn. Alex tended to Nate, who was slipping in and out of consciousness. The fire crackled, but it felt like a fragile barrier against the looming threat. When dawn finally arrived, they resumed their trek, their pace agonizingly slow. The creature followed them, its eyes flashing in the shadows but never attacking. It was toying with them, a predator savoring its prey. They reached the truck just as the sun cleared the horizon, its warmth a small comfort. Nate was unconscious by then, his breathing shallow. They loaded him into the back and sped down the winding road, the tires kicking up dust as they fled. They didn't call the police. What could they say? That something unexplainable had attacked them? Instead, they drove straight to the nearest hospital, where they left Nate in the care of confused but unquestioning doctors. Back in Denver, Damien couldn't escape the memories. The creature had taken more than just Nate's blood. It had stolen the sense of safety he had always felt in the wilderness. Some places, Damien realized, were better left untouched. The Appalachians were one of them. A hunting trip in Arizona. The rain drizzled steadily as Robert Rambo leaned against the truck, scanning the expanse of woodland ahead. Spring rains had turned the Arizona highlands lush and green, a sharp contrast to the arid plains back home in Texas. The group, Robert, his cousin Ethan, and their longtime friend Billy, had driven in the day before, their truck loaded with rifles, gear, and enough supplies to last them a few days if needed. Robert was from Amarillo, a place of sprawling flatlands and relentless winds, where the sunsets stretched for miles over an endless horizon. He'd always enjoyed the freedom of open spaces, but there was something captivating about the wooded canyons of Arizona, where the thick trees and rolling hills seemed alive with secrets. The group wasn't hunting anything specific, just out to enjoy the quiet and test their aim. They parked near a dirt trail that snaked into the woods and set out on foot, their boots squelching slightly on the rain-soaked ground. The sky was a dull gray and the air smelled of wet earth and pine. The day passed uneventfully at first. They spotted a few deer but decided to let them go, saving their energy for something larger. By late afternoon, they set up a small fire under a natural rock overhang to dry off and have lunch. The crackling flames brought warmth, but the rain continued to patter outside their shelter. "Feels good to be out here," Billy said, poking at the fire with a stick. "Beats sitting behind a desk any day." Robert nodded in agreement, but kept his eyes on the woods. Something about the stillness was unsettling. He had spent too many nights watching YouTube videos about cryptids and urban legends, and the Arizona wilderness was no stranger to strange tales. Stories of werewolf-like creatures, some called dogmen, others lumped in with skinwalkers, had been especially chilling. "You think we'll see anything weird out here?" Robert asked, half joking. Ethan smirked. "Like Bigfoot? You been watching those videos again?" "Not Bigfoot," Robert muttered, his voice lower. "More like..." A low growl interrupted him. The three of them froze. It came from somewhere beyond the edge of the firelight, deep and guttural, unmistakably animal, but off. It wasn't a bear, and it didn't sound like a coyote. "What the hell was that?" Billy whispered, his hand instinctively reaching for his rifle. The growl came again, closer this time. A rustling followed, like something heavy moving through the underbrush. Robert's heart pounded as he scanned the darkness, his fingers tightening on his rifle's grip. Then they saw it. Just at the edge of the firelight, a shape emerged. It was massive, easily standing over 7 feet when it rose on its hind legs. Its fur was matted and black, clinging to a muscular frame. The head was unmistakably canine, but the eyes, burning a feral yellow, were intelligent, locked onto them with predatory intent. Jesus Christ, Ethan breathed. The creature let out an ear-splitting howl, a sound that seemed to reverberate in their very bones. Then it lunged. Billy fired first, the gunshot ringing out, but it did little to deter the creature. It closed the distance in seconds, swiping at Billy with claws like knives. Billy went down with a cry. His chest ripped open before he could get off another shot. "Run!" Robert yelled, grabbing Ethan by the arm. They sprinted into the woods, the rain pouring harder now, turning the ground slick and treacherous. Robert's mind raced. He could hear the creature behind them, its heavy breaths and the thudding of its paws on the wet earth. Ethan stumbled, crying out as he twisted his ankle. Robert skidded to a halt, helping him to his feet. "Come on, man. We've got to keep moving." The creature's howl echoed again, closer this time. It wasn't giving up. They had no choice but to keep going, despite Ethan's limp slowing them down. The rain was relentless, soaking them to the bone and making it nearly impossible to see. Robert thought of his father, a stoic man who had taught him how to hunt and survive in the wild. His dad's words echoed in his mind. Always keep moving. Don't stop until you're safe. They finally reached the truck, their breaths ragged and their clothes plastered to their skin. Robert yanked the door open and shoved Ethan inside before scrambling into the driver's seat. He fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking as the creature's growls grew louder. Just as the engine roared to life, the werewolf-like beast appeared, charging out of the trees. It slammed into the truck, denting the side panel and cracking the windshield. Robert floored the gas, the tires spinning in the mud before finding traction. The truck lurched forward, throwing the creature off balance. Robert didn't look back. He drove like a madman, the winding dirt road barely visible through the rain. He could still hear the creature's howls, fading with distance, but never far enough for comfort. By the time they reached the main road, the sun had started to break through the clouds. They didn't call the police. What would they say? That a monster from their nightmares had killed Billy and chased them out of the woods? They knew no one would believe them. Instead, they drove in silence, the weight of what they had seen hanging heavy in the air. Robert glanced at the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the creature's glowing eyes staring back. He thought of Billy, of how they'd laughed around the fire just hours before. Back in Texas, Robert couldn't shake the images from his mind. The rain-soaked woods, the glowing eyes, the howl that still haunted his dreams. The wilderness had always been a place of solace for him, but now it felt like a place of shadows where ancient horrors still roamed. Some stories, he realized, weren't just stories. The sun hung high in the Wyoming sky, obscured by a thick layer of gray clouds that stretched as far as the horizon. Sylvester Stallone pulled his beat-up sedan into the lone gas station at the edge of a dusty highway. It was the kind of place that seemed untouched by time, with peeling paint on the pumps and a weathered sign swaying in the wind. The clouds above threatened rain, but none came, leaving the air heavy and suffocating. Sylvester, or Sylv to those who knew him back in Lawrence, Kansas, stepped out of the car and stretched his legs. Lawrence was a quiet town, with red brick streets and old houses lined with elm trees. It was the kind of place where everyone knew your name, and summers were filled with long, lazy days. This trip to Wyoming was supposed to be a break, a chance to clear his head after a rough patch at work. The station's clerk, an older man with deep-set eyes, barely glanced up as Sylv stepped inside. He grabbed a bottle of water and a bag of chips, paying in cash before heading back to his car. Something about the station made him uneasy. The silence, perhaps, or the way the clerk seemed to watch him from the corner of his eye. As Sylv pulled back onto the highway, he noticed a small dirt road branching off into the woods. A sign, barely legible through the grime, read, "Picnic Area 2 miles." On a whim, he turned down the road, the gravel crunching beneath his tires. The picnic area was deserted, a clearing surrounded by dense pines that swayed gently in the breeze. He parked the car and wandered toward a small fire pit, its charred stones blackened by countless campfires. The air was cooler here, and the shadows under the trees seemed to stretch longer than they should. He set up a small fire using some wood left behind, more out of boredom than necessity. As he watched the flames dance, his thoughts drifted to his family. His younger sister, Gina, always teased him about his impromptu road trips. "You're just running away," she'd say with a smirk, though her tone was more playful than accusatory. He missed her, he realized, and the warmth of home. The first sound came just as dusk began to settle, a low, guttural growl that seemed to vibrate through the air. Sylv froze, his eyes scanning the tree line. "Probably just a coyote," he muttered, though the sound didn't match the sharp yips he was used to hearing on Kansas nights. Then he saw it. At first, it was just a shape, a shadow moving unnaturally between the trees. As it stepped into the dim light of the fire, Sylv's breath caught in his throat. The creature was tall and gaunt, its skin stretched tight over sinewy muscles. Its face was a grotesque mix of human and animal, with sharp, angular features and eyes that glowed faintly in the dying light. He didn't know how long he sat there, frozen, before the creature moved. It prowled closer, its long limbs carrying it with an unnatural grace. Sylv scrambled back toward his car, heart pounding as he fumbled with his keys. Before he could reach the door, something heavy slammed into him, knocking him to the ground. His vision blurred as he felt claws rake across his arm, a searing pain that left him gasping. The creature didn't kill him. Instead, it dragged him into the woods, its grip ironclad despite his struggles. Sylv lost track of time as they moved deeper into the forest. The trees grew denser, the air colder. When they finally stopped, he found himself in a small clearing surrounded by twisted, gnarled trees. The creature left him there, disappearing into the shadows with an eerie silence. He sat by the fire, which still smoldered faintly, wrapping his torn arm with a strip of his shirt. His mind raced, piecing together fragmented thoughts and half-remembered stories. He had seen videos online about the Ruguru, a creature from Native American lore that preyed on the lost and the vulnerable. He had dismissed them as nonsense then, but now he wasn't so sure. The night passed in fits of fear and exhaustion. The creature's eyes appeared in the darkness more than once, watching, waiting. Sylv didn't dare sleep, keeping the fire alive with whatever he could find. When dawn finally broke, he saw his chance. The creature had disappeared, perhaps retreating to wherever it hid during the day. Sylv stumbled through the woods, guided by the faint hum of the highway in the distance. It wasn't long before he broke through the tree line, the sight of the open road filling him with a surge of hope. He waved frantically as a pickup truck approached, its driver, a middle-aged woman, slamming on the brakes. She didn't ask many questions as he climbed into the cab, bloodied and disheveled. "You're lucky I came by," she said, her eyes scanning the woods with suspicion. Sylv didn't argue. As the truck rumbled toward town, he glanced back at the forest, half expecting to see the creature watching him from the shadows. But the woods were still, the only movement the swaying of the pines in the morning breeze. He never told anyone about what happened. Back in Lawrence, he avoided the woods and refused to watch any more cryptid videos. The scars on his arm faded with time, but the memory of that summer day in Wyoming never did. Some places, he realized, weren't meant to be explored. The icy Maine air stung Sam Smith's face as he stepped out of his truck, his breath rising in frosty plumes. He pulled his jacket tighter, glancing around the snow-covered clearing. The woods stretched endlessly in every direction, their tall pines heavy with fresh snowfall. A frozen lake gleamed through the trees, its surface a smooth sheet of ice reflecting the pale winter sun. Sam had driven up from Boulder a few days ago, hoping for some solitude and good fishing. Boulder was a bustling town in the shadows of the Rockies, where the winters were cold but invigorating, and the summers brought tourists in droves. Fishing had been his father's favorite pastime, a passion Sam had picked up over the years. This trip, though, was less about fishing and more about getting away from the stress of city life. The first 2 days passed uneventfully. Sam spent the mornings drilling holes in the ice and dropping his lines, his small portable heater keeping him warm as he waited for a bite. The afternoons were spent exploring the woods, his boots crunching through the snow as he marveled at the quiet beauty of the landscape. At night, he sat by his campfire, the orange flames casting flickering shadows across the trees. It was during one of those nights that the calm shattered. The sun had set hours ago, and the fire crackled softly as Sam poked at it with a stick. The stillness of the Maine wilderness was absolute, broken only by the occasional creak of tree branches under the weight of snow. But then, a new sound emerged, subtle at first, like the faint rustling of leaves. Sam paused, his hand tightening around the stick. He scanned the darkness beyond the firelight, but there was nothing to see. Just the woods, endless and silent. The sound came again, louder this time. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, and heavy, crunching through the snow. "Hello?" Sam called out, his voice firm but wary. No answer. Then he saw them. 2 pinpoints of light, faint but unmistakable, staring at him from the darkness. They were too high off the ground to belong to any animal he knew. The eyes didn't blink, didn't move, just stared unerringly in his direction. A chill ran down his spine, unrelated to the cold. He had read stories, accounts of strange creatures sighted in the remote woods of New England. Most were dismissed as myths or exaggerations, but now, staring into those unblinking eyes, Sam felt the weight of those tales pressing down on him. The fire sputtered, and the darkness seemed to creep closer. Sam stood, his heart hammering in his chest. The eyes vanished, and for a moment he thought he had imagined the whole thing. But then the footsteps returned, faster this time, circling the camp. He grabbed his flashlight, sweeping the beam across the trees. Nothing. Suddenly, something massive barreled into him from the side, knocking him to the ground. The flashlight went flying, its beam spinning wildly before landing in the snow. He caught a glimpse of the creature, its form shrouded in shadow, long limbs, and a face that seemed to shift and blur, as if it didn't belong to this world. It grabbed him with an unnatural strength, dragging him through the snow despite his struggles. Sam yelled, kicking and clawing at the thing's grip, but it was like fighting against iron. The creature dragged him into the deeper woods, far from the fire and the safety of his camp. When it finally stopped, it dropped him unceremoniously in a small, snow-covered clearing. Then it vanished, melting into the shadows as if it had never been there. Sam sat up, shaking and disoriented. His hands were raw from the cold, and his heart raced in his chest. He had no idea where he was or how far he had been dragged. The woods loomed around him, silent and oppressive. He built a small fire with trembling hands, using the lighter he always carried in his pocket. The flickering flames brought some comfort, but the fear lingered. He couldn't shake the feeling that the creature was still watching him, its eyes hidden in the darkness. As he huddled by the fire, his thoughts drifted to his family. He thought of his mother's warm smile, his brother's teasing jokes during their family fishing trips. He wondered if he'd ever see them again. The night was endless, every sound amplified by his fear. At one point, he thought he saw the creature's eyes again, glinting faintly in the firelight, but they disappeared before he could be sure. When dawn finally broke, he wasted no time. Extinguishing the fire, he started walking, using the rising sun to guide him eastward. The snow was deep, and every step was an effort, but he didn't dare stop. After what felt like hours, he heard the faint hum of a car engine. Hope surged through him, and he pushed himself forward, breaking through the tree line onto the main road. A pickup truck was approaching, its driver slamming on the brakes as Sam stumbled into the road. The man behind the wheel rolled down the window, his expression a mix of concern and confusion. "Need a ride?" he asked. Sam nodded, too exhausted to speak. He climbed into the truck, grateful for the warmth of the cab. "What happened to you?" the driver asked as they pulled away. Sam hesitated, glancing back at the woods. "You wouldn't believe me if I told you," he said finally. When they reached the nearest town, Sam called the police. He told them about the creature, about being dragged through the woods, but their skeptical looks made it clear they didn't believe him. Back in Boulder, Sam tried to put the experience behind him, but the scars, both physical and mental, remained. He stopped going on solo trips, sticking instead to the familiar waters near home. The Maine woods, with their silent trees and unblinking eyes, were a place he would never return to. The snow crunched under Chuck Russell's boots as he trudged up the trail, his breath misting in the frigid air. The Appalachian woods stretched in every direction, their skeletal trees covered in a fresh layer of powder. Chuck adjusted his scarf and looked over his shoulder at the three friends following him, Matt, Sarah, and Ian. All of them were bundled up, their faces red from the cold but glowing with the exhilaration of the hike. Chuck had always loved the outdoors. Growing up in Lawrence, Kansas, he had spent most of his childhood exploring the wide-open prairies and wooded trails outside town. Lawrence was a quiet place, steeped in history, and Chuck's family had roots there going back generations. But the rugged beauty of the Appalachian Mountains was something entirely different, wild, untamed, and brimming with mystery. The group had started early that morning, eager to make the most of the short winter daylight. The snowy trail meandered through dense woods, occasionally opening up to breathtaking views of the valleys below. They had packed light, just snacks, water, and a small emergency kit, planning to finish the hike and be back at their cabin by evening. By midday, the snow had picked up, falling in soft flakes that muted every sound except the crunch of their boots. They stopped in a small clearing to rest and warm their hands by a fire Ian quickly built. The warmth was a welcome reprieve from the biting cold, and they huddled close, laughing and sharing stories. Chuck found himself thinking about his younger brother, Danny, who had always been his partner on hikes back home. Danny was the jokester of the family, the one who could make even the toughest climbs feel fun. Chuck felt a pang of longing, wishing his brother could have joined them on this trip. The peaceful moment was broken by a sound, a low, guttural growl that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. The group froze, their laughter fading as they exchanged uneasy glances. "What was that?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Probably just the wind," Matt said, though his eyes darted nervously toward the dark woods. Chuck didn't say anything. He had heard stories about strange sightings in the Appalachian wilderness, tales of creatures that defied explanation. He had always dismissed them as folklore, the kind of thing locals told to spook tourists. But now, with that growl echoing in his ears, he wasn't sure. They doused the fire and decided to keep moving, sticking closer together as they continued up the trail. The woods felt different now, the once beautiful snow-covered trees looming like silent sentinels. Chuck couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The growl came again, louder this time, followed by the snap of a branch somewhere off to their left. Chuck's heart pounded as he scanned the trees, but all he could see was an endless expanse of white and gray. "Let's pick up the pace," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. They hadn't gone far when the creature appeared. It stepped out from the shadows, its massive form covered in matted fur, its yellow eyes glowing with a predatory light. It looked like a wolf, but its size and the way it moved on two legs marked it as something else entirely, something unnatural. "Oh my God," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. The creature let out a bone-chilling howl, then charged. "Run!" Chuck shouted, shoving Sarah ahead of him as the group bolted down the trail. The snow made running difficult, their boots slipping and sliding as they tried to put distance between themselves and the beast. Chuck heard a scream behind him and turned to see Ian on the ground, the creature looming over him. He wanted to help, but Matt grabbed his arm, dragging him forward. "We can't stop!" Matt yelled, his face pale with terror. They ran blindly, the sound of the creature's snarls fading but not disappearing. When they finally stopped to catch their breath, Sarah was crying, and Matt was clutching his side, gasping for air. "We have to get to the main road," Chuck said, his voice firm. "It's our only chance." The snow was falling harder now, thick flakes that blurred their vision and coated the trail. They moved as quickly as they could, but the silence of the woods was oppressive, every sound amplified by their fear. Chuck kept looking over his shoulder, half expecting to see the creature charging toward them. The group stumbled onto the main road just as the last light of day was fading. A pair of headlights appeared in the distance and they waved frantically, relief washing over them as the car slowed to a stop. The driver, an older man in a worn jacket, rolled down his window. "What happened to you folks?" Chuck hesitated, glancing back at the woods. "We were attacked," he said simply. "Can you take us into town?" The man nodded, and they piled into the car, looking at the warmth of the heater feeling almost surreal after the icy terror of the woods. They didn't call the police. What could they say? That a creature out of legend had killed their friend? Even Chuck wasn't sure what they had seen. But as they drove away, he couldn't help but glance back at the darkened trees, wondering if those glowing yellow eyes were still watching. The snow fell in light, lazy flakes, softening the barren expanse of Arizona's high desert. Arnold Winchester tugged his jacket tighter, cursing under his breath as he stared at the open hood of his car. Steam hissed from the engine, a cruel reminder of his bad luck. This stretch of road was supposed to be a shortcut to Sedona, a scenic route past pine forests and red rock cliffs. Instead, it had become a dead end. Arnold was no stranger to adversity. Growing up in Chicago, he'd learned to navigate icy streets and brutal winters. His father, a mechanic who ran a small garage on the city's south side, had taught him how to handle just about any automotive problem. But out here, miles from the nearest town, even his skills couldn't help. The radiator was cracked and the engine was as good as toast. He pulled his phone from his pocket, only to see "no service" glaring back at him. That, at least, wasn't a surprise. He was deep in the Kaibab Plateau, surrounded by snow-covered pines and rocky outcroppings. The area was eerily quiet, save for the occasional sigh of the wind. It reminded him of winters in Chicago when Lake Michigan would freeze over, turning the shoreline into a ghostly expanse of ice and fog. Arnold grabbed his pack from the back seat and started walking, hoping to find help before nightfall. He knew there was a small village marked on his map about 5 miles south. If he was lucky, he could make it before the temperature plummeted. The woods closed in around him, the tall pines swaying gently in the wind. The snow made every sound sharper, the crunch of his boots echoing like gunshots. He tried to distract himself, thinking about his mother's Sunday dinners, the way she could whip up a feast that made even the coldest Chicago nights feel warm. He missed that, missed the simple comfort of home. About an hour into his trek, he heard it. A low, guttural grunt that stopped him in his tracks. Arnold turned, scanning the trees, but saw nothing. The sound came again, closer this time, and he felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. He'd heard stories about strange things in the woods. Growing up, he devoured tales of cryptids and unexplained phenomena, stories of creatures that defied logic. Bigfoot was a favorite subject, though Arnold had always chalked it up to overactive imaginations and clever hoaxes. Now, standing in the snowy silence with the hair on the back of his neck standing up, he wasn't so sure. He pressed on, quickening his pace. The forest seemed to grow darker, the shadows stretching impossibly long. Then he saw it, or thought he did. A massive figure moved between the trees, too fast and too large to be a deer. Arnold stopped, his heart hammering as he stared into the gloom. The figure was gone, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone. The grunts turned into growls, low and rumbling, coming from somewhere behind him. Arnold broke into a run, his breath puffing out in white clouds as he zigzagged through the trees. He didn't stop until he stumbled into a small clearing, collapsing against a fallen log. His hands were shaking as he fumbled with his lighter, managing to coax a small flame into life. He fed it kindling until the fire roared, casting long shadows across the snow. Sitting there, he tried to make sense of what he'd seen. It couldn't be real. Maybe his mind was playing tricks on him, amplifying his fear of being stranded in the wilderness. He thought of his sister, who always teased him about his love of spooky stories. She'd laugh if she knew he was out here, jumping at shadows. The thought brought a fleeting smile, but it faded quickly. The growls returned, louder now, and Arnold realized they were circling the clearing. He grabbed a branch from the fire, holding it like a torch as he backed away. The creature stepped into the light, and Arnold's blood ran cold. It was massive, at least 8 feet tall, covered in matted brown fur. Its eyes glowed faintly, reflecting the firelight with an unnatural intelligence. Arnold had seen bears before, but this was no bear. Its proportions were wrong. Its arms too long, its posture eerily human. The creature let out a deafening roar, and Arnold knew he was out of options. He ran, the firebrand still clutched in his hand, the creature crashing through the woods behind him. Branches tore at his clothes, and the cold air burned his lungs, but he didn't stop. He followed the slope downhill, hoping it would lead him to the road. The snow was deeper here, making every step an effort. He could hear the creature gaining on him, its guttural snarls cutting through the night. Just when he thought he couldn't go any farther, the forest thinned, and he saw the faint glow of streetlights ahead. Arnold burst onto the road, waving his arms frantically as a pair of headlights approached. The car skidded to a stop, and the driver, a middle-aged man with a wildered expression, threw open the door. "Get in," the man shouted. Arnold didn't need to be told twice. He dove into the passenger seat, like slamming the door just as the creature emerged from the trees. The driver hit the gas, and the car sped away, leaving the monstrous figure behind. Neither of them spoke until they reached the village, the warm glow of its windows a stark contrast to the darkness they'd left behind. Arnold thanked the driver and staggered into a small diner where the smell of coffee and fried food brought tears to his eyes. He didn't call the police. What could he say? That he'd been chased by Bigfoot? Instead, he sat in the corner booth staring out at the snowy night, trying to convince himself it had all been a nightmare. But deep down, he knew better. He'd seen the impossible, and it had seen him too. The Wyoming wilderness stretched out endlessly, a patchwork of jagged hills, sprawling meadows, and dense pine forests. Spring had thawed the snow, leaving behind damp earth and the soft hum of life returning to the land. Sylvester Cage adjusted the strap on his rifle as he trudged through the undergrowth, flanked by his 2 longtime friends, Mark and Daniel. The air smelled of pine and wet soil, a far cry from the smog-laden streets of Los Angeles. Here, the world felt raw and untamed. The trio had been hunting together for years, their trips an annual tradition born out of shared passion and the need to escape their busy lives. For Sylvester, these outings were a reprieve from the suffocating pace of the city, where every day felt like a battle against time and ambition. He thought about his father, who had introduced him to hunting their family vacations in the Sierra Nevada mountains. His father's patience and skill with a bow were legendary, traits Sylvester admired but struggled to emulate. This year's trip had brought them to the heart of Wyoming's wilderness, an area known for its game-rich forests and breathtaking vistas. It was sunny, the light filtering through the canopy in golden streaks, but the warmth did little to dispel the chill that lingered in the shadows. By the second evening, they had set up camp in a clearing near a small creek. The fire crackled, sending sparks into the fading light as they recounted stories of past hunts. Sylvester leaned back against his pack, letting the conversation wash over him. His thoughts drifted to the stories he'd read online about the region, tales of strange occurrences and whispered legends of skinwalkers. He dismissed them as folklore, the kind of campfire stories meant to thrill and terrify. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the forest, a sudden stillness settled over the camp. The usual chorus of crickets and distant rustlings ceased, replaced by an oppressive silence. Sylvester's hand instinctively went to his rifle as he scanned the tree line. That's when he saw it. A figure crouched behind a tree at the edge of the clearing, barely visible in the dim light. It was humanoid but wrong, its limbs too long, its posture unnatural. The eyes caught the firelight, reflecting a faint, malevolent glow. Sylvester froze, his breath hitching as the creature tilted its head as if studying him. "Do you see that?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. Mark and Daniel followed his gaze, their expressions shifting from confusion to alarm. The figure didn't move, its unblinking stare fixed on them. Sylvester's mind raced. It could be a person, someone lost or playing a prank, but something about it felt off. Predatory. Primal. Without warning, the creature vanished into the darkness, moving so quickly it seemed to blur. The trio sat in stunned silence, the weight of what they'd just witnessed pressing down on them. "We're leaving," Sylvester said, his voice firm, at first light. They kept the fire burning high that night, taking turns standing watch. Sylvester sat with his back to the flames, his rifle across his lap, listening to the forest. The occasional snap of a branch or rustle of leaves set his nerves on edge, but the creature didn't return. By morning, the sunny sky belied the tension that hung over them. They packed their gear in record time and started the trek back to their truck, sticking close together as they navigated the uneven terrain. The woods, once vibrant and inviting, now felt oppressive, every shadow a potential hiding place. Halfway through their journey, the creature struck. It came out of nowhere, a blur of motion and guttural growls. Daniel screamed as the thing knocked him to the ground, its claws raking across his arm. Sylvester fired his rifle, the sound deafening in the confined space. The creature recoiled, its cry a bone-chilling mix of pain and rage. "Run!" Sylvester shouted, grabbing Mark by the arm. They ran, adrenaline pushing them forward as the forest seemed to close in around them. The creature gave chase, its inhuman cries echoing through the trees. They stumbled onto a narrow game trail, the packed dirt offering a mercifully clear path. Daniel lagged behind, clutching his bleeding arm. Sylvester turned and fired again, the shot grazing the creature and buying them precious seconds. They burst out of the forest onto the main road, lungs burning and legs trembling. A pickup truck approached, the driver slamming on the brakes as they waved frantically. The driver, a wiry old man with a look of bewildered concern, helped them into the truck. "What the hell happened to you boys?" he asked, eyeing Daniel's injury. "Animal attack," Sylvester said quickly, unwilling to elaborate. The ride to the nearest town was silent, the trio too shaken to speak. They dropped Daniel at the local clinic before heading to a diner to regroup. Over cups of scalding coffee, they debated whether to report what had happened. In the end, they decided against it. Who would believe them? Sylvester stared out the diner window at the bustling street, the morning sun casting long shadows across the pavement. The events of the past night felt surreal, like a waking nightmare. But the scars on Daniel's arm and the fear etched into his friends' faces were proof enough. As they left the diner, Sylvester glanced at the distant tree line, a shiver running down his spine. He didn't know what they had encountered out there, but one thing was certain: the Wyoming wilderness held secrets he had no desire to uncover again. The thick canopy of autumn leaves stretched overhead, casting dappled light onto the winding main road. Chuck Winchester leaned forward in the driver's seat, peering through the windshield at the sudden flurry of snowflakes. It was unexpected for this time of year, but the weather here didn't follow the neat patterns of Los Angeles. The chill in the air and the sharp scent of pine were reminders that they were far from home. The car sputtered once, twice, and then died, coasting to a halt on the side of the road. Chuck cursed under his breath, gripping the wheel. In the back seat, his friends Gina and Paul exchanged uneasy glances. The last sign of civilization they'd passed had been miles ago, a dilapidated gas station with a faded closed for the season sign swinging in the breeze. "Great," Paul muttered. "Just great. Middle of nowhere, and now this." Chuck popped the hood, stepping out into the crisp air. The snow was falling steadily now, blanketing the trees and the road in white. He tried to shake the memory of his father fixing their old station wagon back when he was a kid. His dad's patience had been legendary, and Chuck could almost hear his voice guiding him through the repair. But as Chuck fiddled with the engine, it became clear this was beyond his skill. They decided to hike to find help, or at least shelter. The trio grabbed their packs and set off, following the narrow road that wound through the woods. The snow muffled their footsteps, and the silence was eerie, broken only by the occasional snap of a branch underfoot. By late afternoon, they stumbled upon an old cabin, tucked back among the trees. It was weathered but intact, with a stone chimney that suggested it might still have a working fireplace. Reluctantly, they decided to stay the night. As darkness fell, they gathered around a fire Gina had managed to kindle in the hearth. The warmth was welcome, but the flickering shadows it cast on the walls did little to ease their nerves. Outside, the snow had turned the landscape into a silent, monochrome world. Chuck thought back to evenings with his younger brother, Dean, who had always been the braver one. Dean had a knack for making light of even the darkest situations. Chuck could almost hear him now, teasing him for getting stranded in the middle of nowhere. He missed that easy laughter, the way it could cut through tension like a knife. The first sign of trouble came with a sound, low, guttural, and inhuman. It carried through the still night, causing the fire to flicker as if the air itself trembled. Paul shot Chuck a look, his eyes wide. "Probably just a coyote," Gina whispered, though her voice wavered. But Chuck wasn't so sure. He moved to the window, peering out into the darkness. For a moment, he saw nothing but snow and trees. Then, just beyond the tree line, something moved. It was too large to be a coyote. Its silhouette was vaguely humanoid, but hunched, with long limbs and glowing eyes that reflected the firelight like embers. "Guys," Chuck said, backing away from the window. "We're not alone." The creature moved fast, faster than anything should. One moment it was at the edge of the forest. The next, it was circling the cabin, its guttural growls vibrating in their chests. The three of them huddled by the fire, their breaths coming in short, sharp gasps. Gina clutched a heavy iron poker, her knuckles white. Paul had a hunting knife, though his hands shook as he gripped it. Chuck searched the room, his heart pounding. They needed a plan, but panic was setting in, making it hard to think. For hours, the creature circled the cabin, its movements barely visible through the small, frosted windows. It seemed to be testing them, waiting for a moment of weakness. They could hear it scraping against the wooden walls, its claws carving shallow grooves into the boards. At some point during the night, the sounds stopped. The silence was almost worse, every creak of the cabin amplified by their fear. None of them slept. As dawn broke, they made their move. The creature was nowhere to be seen, but its tracks crisscrossed the snow outside, deep and clawed. They set out on foot, heading back toward the car. The woods felt alive with unseen eyes, every shadow a potential hiding place. Then it came again. This time it attacked with savage force, lunging at them from behind a cluster of trees. Paul screamed as the creature's claws raked across his arm, sending him sprawling into the snow. Chuck fired the flare gun he'd found in the cabin, the brilliant light startling the creature long enough for them to drag Paul to his feet. They ran, the creature in pursuit, its guttural growls echoing through the trees. Gina tripped, her pack spilling onto the ground. Chuck turned back, pulling her to her feet as the creature closed in. He fired the flare gun again, the second shot sending it skittering back into the shadows. When they finally reached the car, their hands were numb and trembling as they fumbled with the keys. The engine sputtered to life, and Chuck floored the gas, the tires spinning in the snow before finding traction. As they sped down the road, the creature emerged from the trees one last time, its glowing eyes watching them until they disappeared from view. They drove without stopping until they reached the nearest town, a sleepy hamlet with a diner and a gas station. Paul's arm was bandaged, his face pale and drawn. They debated going to the police, but decided against it. What could they say? That they'd been hunted by something out of a nightmare? Chuck sat in the diner, nursing a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. He stared out the window at the snowy street, his mind replaying the events of the past 2 days. He didn't know what they had encountered in those woods, but one thing was certain. Maine's wilderness held secrets he never wanted to uncover again. The dense Wisconsin forest was silent, save for the crunch of snow underfoot and the distant sound of water lapping against the icy banks of the river. John Johnson tugged his parka tighter, the cold biting through even the thickest layers. He had grown up in Wichita, where the winters were harsh, but nothing like this. The air here felt different, heavier, quieter, as if the snow itself muffled sound. John and his two friends, Mark and Eddie, had driven up for a winter fishing trip, hoping to take advantage of the solitude and untouched beauty of the area. They had chosen this remote spot, miles from the nearest town, to escape the bustle of their lives. For John, it was a rare break from the hum of aircraft engines back home. His job as a mechanic at a small regional airport kept him busy, his days marked by the smell of jet fuel and the clanging of metal. The first night passed uneventfully. They set up camp near the frozen river, their tents pitched in a clearing surrounded by towering pines. The fire crackled warmly as they traded stories, their breath misting in the freezing air. John thought of his sister, who had teased him about taking a vacation in the dead of winter. "You could have gone to the Gulf or something," she'd said, rolling her eyes. But for John, there was something soothing about the stark stillness of this place. By the second day, the weather had turned. A steady drizzle began mid-morning, the rain freezing into a slick glaze on every surface. The fishing was poor, the river reluctant to give up its secrets. Eddie, always the optimist, joked that they should have brought a deck of cards instead of fishing rods. Mark, who had been unusually quiet, kept glancing at the woods. "Something feels off," he muttered as they packed up their gear to head back to camp. "I don't know, man. Like we're being watched." John laughed it off, though he couldn't shake the feeling either. The shadows among the trees seemed to shift when he wasn't looking, and the quiet of the forest felt too complete, too deliberate. That night, as the rain tapered off, they sat around the fire, trying to ignore the oppressive darkness that pressed in on all sides. Mark was sharpening his knife, the rhythmic scrape grating against John's nerves. Eddie was staring into the flames, uncharacteristically subdued. The first sign of trouble came as a sound, a low, almost imperceptible hum that seemed to vibrate through the air. John froze, his hand tightening around his mug of coffee. The sound grew louder, closer, until it was joined by a rustling in the underbrush. Something was moving out there, circling their camp. Mark stood, his knife at the ready. "Stay close to the fire," he said, his voice low. The creature emerged from the shadows just at the edge of the firelight. It was unlike anything John had ever seen. Its shape was vaguely humanoid, but wrong. Too long, too angular, with limbs that bent in unnatural ways. Its eyes glowed faintly, reflecting the firelight like mirrors. It didn't move closer, just prowled around the perimeter, its movements fluid and deliberate. Eddie was the first to panic, grabbing a log from the fire and hurling it at the creature. The burning wood fell short, and the thing reacted with a guttural hiss, retreating momentarily into the darkness. Then it lunged. Chaos erupted. Mark slashed at it with his knife, landing a glancing blow that seemed to do little more than anger it. Eddie screamed as the creature's claws raked across his shoulder, sending him sprawling into the snow. John grabbed the hatchet from his pack, swinging wildly. The creature retreated again, melting back into the shadows. But they knew it wasn't gone. They dragged Eddie back to the fire and the scrape, the wound on his shoulder bleeding profusely. John tore strips from his shirt to bandage it, his hands shaking. The rain had started again, a cold, relentless drizzle that soaked through their clothes and extinguished what remained of the fire. They spent the night huddled together, backs to each other, weapons in hand. The creature didn't return, but they could hear it out there, pacing, its low hum reverberating through the forest. John's thoughts drifted to his mother, who had always told him he had too much curiosity for his own good. She would have scolded him for coming to a place like this, where the trees seemed to whisper secrets, and the dark was more than just an absence of light. By morning, the rain had turned to sleet, and Eddie's wound was starting to swell. They had no choice but to move. Packing quickly, they set off through the woods, following the faint outline of the trail that had brought them here. The creature stalked them the entire way. It stayed just out of sight, its movements marked by the occasional snap of a branch or the flash of those glowing eyes. They quickened their pace, slipping on the icy ground, their breath coming in gasps. Eddie was the first to fall. His strength gave out, and he collapsed in the snow, too weak to continue. John and Mark lifted him between them, their own muscles screaming with the effort. They pushed on, desperation driving them forward. When they finally reached the main road, it felt like a miracle. The asphalt was wet and slick, the rain still falling steadily, but the sight of a pickup truck approaching from the distance was the most beautiful thing John had ever seen. They flagged it down, and the driver, a gruff old man with a rifle in his back seat, helped them load Eddie into the cab. They didn't explain what had happened. What could they say? That they'd been hunted by something that defied explanation? They just asked to be taken to the nearest hospital, their voices hollow with exhaustion. As the truck pulled away, John glanced back at the forest. For a moment, he thought he saw movement among the trees, a flicker of something unnatural. Then it was gone, swallowed by the shadows. He turned away, his mind replaying the events of the past few days. Whatever they had encountered out there, it wasn't something he wanted to face again. Some mysteries, he thought, were better left unsolved. Gary Smith leaned back in the creaking chair on the porch of the cabin, gazing out at the darkening woods. The air was still, thick with the scent of pine and the faint aroma of dust carried on the summer breeze. Arizona was a different world from Mississippi, where he'd grown up surrounded by flatlands and slow-moving rivers. Here, the jagged mountains loomed in the distance, and the air seemed sharper, almost electric. The cabin had been Eddie's idea, a rustic getaway for their group to celebrate finishing another grueling semester. Eddie had insisted the isolation would be good for the soul, though Gary suspected it was more about Eddie wanting to show off his survival skills. Tina and Paul had come along for the ride, and Gary, needing a break from the monotony of part-time gigs and endless heat back home, had reluctantly agreed. That evening, as they sat around the fire pit outside the cabin, a sudden chill seemed to sweep through the woods. Gary poked at the flames with a stick, watching the sparks rise into the air. The summer had brought no reprieve to the dry lands, but tonight, an unexpected snow flurry had begun to fall, light and ethereal. Snow in the Arizona summer. It was strange, but not unheard of, especially at higher elevations. Still, it made the woods feel otherworldly, as though they were trapped in a dream. "You ever hear about the creatures out here?" Eddie asked, leaning forward with a conspiratorial grin. "Like the weird stuff? Skinwalkers? Shadow people? That kind of thing?" Gary chuckled nervously, remembering a magazine he'd read at a gas station on the way up. The article had been sensationalist, but it detailed sightings of strange, unidentified creatures across the Southwest. He hadn't taken it seriously, chalking it up to tall tales, but now, in the flickering firelight, the stories crept back into his mind. "I don't believe in any of that," Tina said firmly, though her eyes darted to the dark line of trees. "It's just folklore." "Folklore usually comes from somewhere," Eddie countered, his grin widening. "You just wait. Something's gonna happen tonight." Paul rolled his eyes, pulling his hoodie tighter against the chill. "Yeah, like you snoring loud enough to scare the wildlife." The banter eased the tension, and they sat there for a while longer, laughing and sharing stories. But as the fire began to die down, Gary felt a prickle of unease. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them. When they finally retired to the cabin, Gary couldn't sleep. The wind howled faintly outside, and the snow continued to fall, creating a thin, pale blanket on the forest floor. Unable to rest, he got up and peered out the window. The trees stood like silent sentinels, their shadows long and foreboding in the moonlight. And then he saw it. At first, he thought it was a trick of the light, but as his eyes adjusted, he realized there was something behind one of the trees, barely visible. It was humanoid in shape, but its proportions were wrong, too tall, too lean. Its pale, featureless face stared directly at the cabin, unblinking. Gary's breath caught in his throat. He stumbled back from the window, covered, heart pounding. "Guys," he hissed, waking Eddie and Paul. There's something out there." Eddie groaned, half asleep. "Probably just a deer or something." "No," Gary insisted. "It's not a deer." Reluctantly, Eddie got up, grabbing a flashlight. He and Paul followed Gary to the window, but the figure was gone. "See?" Eddie said with a yawn. "Nothing." But Gary wasn't convinced. He didn't sleep at all, and by morning his unease had spread to the others. Tina, who had been skeptical the night before, now seemed jittery, constantly glancing over her shoulder. Later that afternoon, as they prepared to hike a nearby trail, the creature revealed itself again. This time, there was no mistaking it. It moved with unnatural grace, darting from tree to tree just out of sight. The group froze, their laughter and conversation cut short. "What the hell is that?" Tina whispered, her voice trembling. Before anyone could answer, the creature lunged. It was fast, faster than anything they'd ever seen. Paul was the closest, and it took him down in an instant. His scream echoed through the forest, chilling Gary to his core. Eddie swung his hatchet wildly, but the creature evaded him with almost mocking ease. "Run!" Gary shouted, grabbing Tina's arm. They sprinted back toward the cabin, Eddie close behind. Paul's screams faded, replaced by an eerie silence. Inside the cabin, they barricaded the door with furniture, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. Tina was sobbing, and Eddie's hands shook as he clutched his hatchet. Gary stared at the bloodstains on the floor, unable to process what had just happened. They spent the night huddled together, weapons in hand. The creature didn't try to break in, but they could hear it outside, its heavy footsteps circling the cabin. At one point, Gary thought he heard it whispering, an unintelligible sound that made his skin crawl. When dawn finally broke, they knew they had to leave. Gathering what little courage they had left, they made a run for the car. The snow had stopped, but the forest was eerily silent, as if holding its breath. The creature followed them, always just out of reach. They could feel its presence, a weight in the air. When they finally reached the car, Eddie fumbled with the keys, his hands slick with sweat. The engine roared to life, and they sped down the dirt road, not daring to look back. They didn't call the police. What could they say? That something unexplainable had killed their friend? It felt too surreal, too nightmarish to share. As they drove away, Gary stared out the window, the weight of guilt and fear pressing down on him. He thought of his family back in Mississippi, how his mother used to warn him about going too far into the woods. "The forest doesn't always welcome visitors," she'd say. For the first time, Gary understood what she meant. Michael Stallone trudged along the dirt trail winding through the dense Montana woods, sweat glistening on his brow despite the coolness of the shaded forest. The stillness was punctuated by the occasional rustle of leaves or the chirp of distant birds. Montana was a far cry from the crowded streets and sun-drenched beaches of Miami, but that was precisely why Michael had come. A break from the relentless heat and noise of the city felt like a gift, even if the quiet sometimes pressed in too close. The hike had started as a simple escape, just a day's walk to clear his mind and soak in the beauty of the wilderness. Michael had always liked the idea of solitude, but now, alone among the towering pines and snow-dappled peaks, he found himself missing the buzz of human life. The weather had taken an odd turn too, snow in summer. It fell lightly through the treetops, catching the sunlight like tiny crystals. At first, Michael thought it was ash from a distant fire, but no, it was definitely snow. He paused at a clearing, resting against a large rock as he drank from his water bottle. The silence here was deeper, almost suffocating. He'd read about Montana's vast wilderness, how it was home to creatures that rarely showed themselves. Michael wasn't superstitious, but he'd heard whispers of strange stories, legends passed down by locals. One name stuck out from his online rabbit hole, Rugaru. The name carried a certain weight, a sense of unease that he had laughed off when he'd read it. But now, standing alone in the quiet forest, Michael couldn't help but wonder. A snap of a branch brought him sharply back to the present. His heart skipped a beat as he turned toward the sound. About 20 yards away, partially obscured by a cluster of trees, something moved. It was too large to be a deer, and the shape was all wrong. He strained to see through the shifting shadows. Then he heard it, a low growl, guttural and resonant, followed by a chilling, almost human-like screech that echoed through the woods. Michael froze, every muscle in his body screaming at him to run, but his feet felt glued to the earth. The thing stepped closer, still hidden in the trees. From what little he could see, it stood upright, its hulking frame covered in patches of matted fur. Its eyes glinted in the dim light, a yellowish hue that seemed to pierce right through him. Michael's breath hitched as it let out another growl, this one deep enough to vibrate the ground beneath him. He bolted. Adrenaline coursed through his veins as he sprinted back down the trail. The undergrowth tore at his legs and branches whipped at his face, but he didn't dare slow down. Behind him, he could hear the heavy crunch of something pursuing him, its strides unnaturally long and deliberate. The trail twisted and turned, and Michael's mind raced alongside his pounding heart. He thought of his family back in Miami, his sister always teasing him for being a wannabe adventurer, his mom's constant reminders to be careful. "Nature's beautiful, but it doesn't play fair," she'd say. Those words felt painfully true now. Night fell quickly, and with it came a biting chill. Michael knew he couldn't keep running indefinitely. His legs ached, and his breath burned in his chest. He found a small clearing surrounded by thick trees and decided to stop. He gathered what little dry wood he could find and started a fire, the small flames offering a fragile sense of security. The night dragged on, each minute feeling like an eternity. The creature didn't make an appearance, but Michael could feel it out there, circling, watching. The wind carried faint noises, branches snapping, low grunts, the shuffle of heavy feet. He tried to distract himself, staring into the flames and letting his mind drift to happier times. His dad, long gone now, had taught him how to light a fire during their camping trips. The memory was bittersweet, a reminder of simpler days. A sudden slam against a nearby tree snapped him out of his thoughts. The force shook the ground, and Michael's fire sputtered as if recoiling from the impact. His heart raced anew as he grabbed a burning stick, holding it like a weapon. The darkness beyond the firelight seemed alive, shifting and closing in. The creature didn't charge, but it didn't retreat either. It stayed just out of reach, its presence oppressive and unrelenting. Michael didn't sleep that night. He couldn't. He sat by the dwindling fire, gripping the stick and praying for dawn. When the first rays of sunlight broke through the trees, Michael knew he had to move. He gathered his things quickly, his every sense on high alert. The trail back to the main road was long, and he doubted he could outrun the creature if it decided to attack again. As he pushed forward, he heard it trailing him, a constant reminder that he wasn't alone. The noises grew louder, the footsteps heavier. Michael stumbled, but forced himself to keep going, the promise of the road and potential safety pulling him forward. Finally, he saw it, a sliver of asphalt through the trees. Relief surged through him as he broke into a run. He didn't look back, not even when the growl came again, this time closer than ever. He burst onto the road just as a pickup truck rounded the bend. Waving frantically, Michael flagged it down. The driver, an older man with a skeptical look, hesitated before letting him in. Michael didn't explain much, just muttered something about a bear and begged to be taken to the nearest town. The truck sped away. Michael allowed himself to breathe. His body ached, his mind reeled, but he was alive. The driver tried to make small talk, but Michael's thoughts were elsewhere. On the creature, on the forest, on the stories he'd foolishly dismissed. Whatever it was, he knew one thing for certain. The wilderness didn't play fair. Dean Evans tightened his parka against the sharp chill of the New York winter as he trudged through the snow-laden trail. The Adirondacks were as beautiful as he'd imagined, the trees frosted with powder and the mountains towering in the distance like silent sentinels. Snow had been falling lightly all morning, its delicate touch a stark contrast to the bitter cold. Dean, who grew up in Lawrence, Kansas, wasn't used to this kind of relentless frost. The flat plains of home were prone to icy winds, but the chill there never seemed to carry the same bite as the deep woods in winter. He'd come here for solitude, a few days of camping and hiking to clear his mind. A messy breakup and the monotony of work had pushed him to seek escape. It had been years since his last trip like this, but the old camping gear still worked fine. He liked the thought of braving the wilderness alone, just him and nature. On his second day, he reached a clearing nestled between towering pines. He set up camp quickly, brushing snow off the ground to make space for his tent. As the evening came, he started a fire, its warm glow pushing back the encroaching darkness. He sat close, eating a simple meal and letting the flames melt away the day's tension. Dean thought of his family as he stared into the fire, their voices surfacing from the past. His mom's laugh, his dad's steady voice. His brother Mark, always teasing him about his love for these wilderness retreats. Mark had once joked that Dean would end up in a tabloid headline, "Man found in woods, eaten by bear." The memory made him smile. The quiet of the night settled in, broken only by the occasional crack of the fire or the distant howl of the wind. Then suddenly there was another sound, a faint crunch of snow. Dean froze, his hand tightening around his mug of coffee. It was faint, deliberate, and too heavy to be a deer. He scanned the shadows beyond the firelight but saw nothing. Then he heard it again. The hair on the back of his neck prickled. Slowly, he reached for his flashlight, clicking it on and shining it toward the trees. At first, the beam revealed nothing but snow-covered trunks and darkness. But then his light caught something, a shadowy figure, half hidden behind a massive tree trunk. It stood tall, impossibly tall, with broad shoulders and a thick, fur-covered frame. Dean's breath hitched. The figure didn't move. It simply stood there, watching. He couldn't make out its face, but he could feel its gaze, heavy and unblinking. The fire crackled behind him, its warmth suddenly feeling much too small, much too fragile. He had read about Bigfoot before, stories and supposed sightings in magazines, most of which he'd dismissed as hoaxes or exaggerations. But now, with this massive figure standing just yards away, those stories came flooding back. His pulse pounded in his ears. The creature didn't move closer, but it didn't retreat either. It just stared. After what felt like an eternity, Dean broke the spell. Slowly he backed toward his tent, keeping his flashlight trained on the figure. As he retreated, it stepped behind the tree, vanishing into the shadows. Dean didn't sleep that night. He doused the fire, packed his essentials, and waited in silence inside his tent. He could hear faint movements outside, the crunch of snow, the occasional snap of a branch. It was circling, keeping just out of sight. When the first light of dawn broke, Dean knew he couldn't stay. He needed to get out. He stuffed what he could into his backpack, leaving behind anything that would slow him down. He moved quietly, stepping carefully to avoid making noise. The forest seemed alive with tension. Every rustle, every sound felt amplified. Dean's breath was visible in the cold air as he moved, each exhale a cloud of panic. He knew the creature was still there. He could feel it. His phone had no signal, so calling for help wasn't an option. Instead, he texted his friend Mark, hoping the message might send later. "Something's following me. Heading back to the trailhead. If you don't hear from me, call for help." Hours passed as Dean made his way through the woods. He stuck to the trail when he could, but more often he veered off, trying to confuse whatever was stalking him. Twice, he glimpsed it, just a flash of movement in his peripheral vision, a hulking shape slipping between the trees. Once, it came close. He crouched behind a fallen log, holding his breath as the creature moved nearby. He could hear its heavy breathing, the crunch of its footsteps. It stayed there for what felt like forever before moving on. Dean didn't move until he was sure it was gone. The sun was high in the sky when he finally saw the dirt road that led to the parking area. Relief surged through him, but he didn't let his guard down. He kept moving, kept scanning the woods until he reached the edge of the trees. His car was in sight, dusted with snow. He ran the last stretch, fumbling with his keys as he unlocked the door and threw himself inside. Turning the ignition, he half expected the car not to start, but the engine roared to life. As he sped away, he glanced in the rearview mirror. For a brief moment, he thought he saw it again, a dark figure standing at the edge of the forest, watching him go. When he reached the nearest town, he pulled into a gas station and sat in his car for a long time, hands trembling on the steering wheel. His phone buzzed. The message to Mark had finally sent, and there was a reply. "What are you talking about? Are you okay?" Dean didn't answer right away. He didn't know how to explain it, didn't even know if he believed it himself. But one thing was certain, the wilderness had eyes, and he wasn't going back anytime soon. Arnold Oldman wiped the sweat from his brow as he pulled into the gravel lot of a gas station in upstate New York. The sun hung high and merciless in the sky, casting a shimmering haze over the dense forest surrounding the remote stop. As a gardener from Boulder, Arnold wasn't used to the oppressive humidity of the East Coast summers. Back home, the dry mountain air was a reprieve, something he'd grown to appreciate after long days working in the dirt. He climbed out of his truck, the heat rolling over him in waves, and stretched his stiff back. The station was an old, weathered thing, its paint peeling and its sign barely legible. There wasn't another car in sight, and the surrounding woods pressed close, the trees thick and shadowy despite the summer sun. Arnold needed gas and a break from the road. He stepped inside the station, where the faint hum of an ancient fan did little to dispel the stifling heat. The clerk behind the counter, a man in his 60s with a deeply lined face, gave Arnold a nod but said nothing. As Arnold grabbed a bottle of water from the cooler, a strange sensation prickled at the back of his neck, like he was being watched. He glanced around the store, but it was empty, save for the clerk. Shaking off the feeling, he paid for his water and gas, then stepped back outside. That's when he noticed it. Across the lot, just beyond the tree line, something moved. At first, Arnold thought it was a dog, large, maybe a stray. But as he squinted against the sunlight, the figure came into sharper focus. It wasn't a dog. It was too big, its limbs too long and sinewy. It crouched low, its yellow eyes catching the light as they fixed on him. Arnold froze. The thing stared at him for what felt like an eternity, then slinked back into the shadows, disappearing among the trees. His heart pounded as he fumbled with the gas pump, without filling his tank as quickly as he could. He'd heard stories about strange creatures in these woods, urban legends and campfire tales about things that weren't quite animal, weren't quite human. Arnold had always dismissed them as nonsense, the kind of stuff people made up to scare themselves. But seeing those eyes, that shape, it was hard to dismiss anything now. He finished fueling and got back in his truck, gripping the steering wheel tightly. He pulled out of the station and drove down the narrow road, but the sense of unease stayed with him. The trees seemed to close in tighter, their shadows stretching longer as the sun began to dip lower in the sky. Then he saw it again. The creature darted across the road in front of him, so fast he barely had time to react. Arnold slammed on the brakes, his truck skidding to a stop. He sat there, breathing hard, his eyes scanning the woods. It was out there. He knew it. He'd watched enough videos online about werewolves and cryptids to recognize the signs. The long limbs, the glowing eyes, the predatory movements. It wasn't just a wild animal, it was something else, something dangerous. Arnold debated turning around and heading back to the gas station, but the thought of going deeper into the forest scared him even more. Instead, he decided to keep moving, hoping he could make it to the next town before nightfall. But the creature wasn't done with him. As Arnold drove, it began to follow. At first, he only caught glimpses of it through the trees, a dark shape moving parallel to the road. Then it got bolder, coming closer, letting him see its hunched form and the way its muscles rippled under its matted fur. Panic set in as the road became rougher, forcing him to slow down. Finally, the inevitable happened. The truck's front tire hit a jagged rock, and the loud pop of a blowout echoed through the woods. Arnold cursed, pulling over to the side of the road. He had no choice but to get out and deal with the tire. The creature's growl rumbled from somewhere nearby, low and menacing. Arnold grabbed the tire iron from the back of his truck, clutching it like a weapon as he scanned the trees. The creature attacked. It came from the shadows, lunging at him with a speed and ferocity that left him no time to think. Arnold swung the tire iron wildly, hitting its shoulder with a sickening thud. The beast snarled, its yellow eyes blazing with fury, but the blow was enough to make it hesitate. Arnold took the chance to run. He sprinted into the woods, the trees closing around him as he fled. He knew he couldn't outrun it, not for long, but he also couldn't stay in the open. As darkness fell, Arnold found a small clearing and built a fire, its flickering light giving him a fragile sense of security. He sat close, gripping the tire iron and straining to hear any sound over the crackle of the flames. The snow that had begun falling earlier now blanketed the ground, muffling everything and making the woods even more eerie. He thought about his family, his sister, who always called him stubborn, and his niece, who'd given him a good luck charm before he left. The charm was still in his pocket, and he clutched it tightly, drawing what little comfort he could from the memory of her smile. The creature circled the clearing, its growls echoing in the darkness. Arnold didn't sleep. He didn't dare. When dawn finally broke, he knew he had to move. The creature wouldn't stop, and he couldn't stay in one place. He moved silently through the woods, staying low and using the trees for cover. Every step was deliberate, every sound a potential giveaway. Hours later, Arnold saw the road. Relief flooded him as he broke into a run, his legs screaming in protest, but his fear driving him forward. He didn't stop until he reached it, collapsing onto the asphalt just as a car came around the bend. The driver, a middle-aged woman, slammed on the brakes and got out, her face a mix of shock and concern. Arnold barely managed to explain what had happened as she helped him into her car and drove him to the nearest town. He never saw the creature again, but he'd never forget those eyes, yellow, hungry, and inhuman. The sharp, dry wind of the Arizona autumn whipped through the trees as Keanu Norris adjusted his rifle strap and glanced over his shoulder at his 3 hunting companions. They were friends from Detroit, a tight-knit group brought together by the grit of the city. Keanu, once a professional MMA fighter, had learned to embrace challenge and danger. But this trip wasn't supposed to be about either. It was meant to be a break from the grind, a chance to connect with nature. The group had driven deep into the forest, far from cell service and well beyond where the desert transitioned into rugged woodland. Keanu had never seen trees like these back home. In Detroit, his world was asphalt, gyms, and the occasional slice of greenery in the form of a park. Here the trees seemed to lean in, thick and towering, their dry needles rustling like whispers in the wind. By midday, the hunt wasn't going as planned. Game was scarce, the wind too loud for stealth, and the forest had an odd stillness that felt unnatural. The group paused to rest by a clearing where the autumn sun filtered weakly through the high branches. Keanu took a deep breath, his instincts prickling. His fighting career had taught him to trust those instincts, and right now they were telling him something wasn't right. As the group joked and passed around a thermos of coffee, Keanu's eyes drifted to the tree line. At first, he thought his mind was playing tricks on him. Then he saw it, something sitting behind a tree. It wasn't entirely hidden. A massive shoulder and part of a head were visible, covered in dark, matted hair. 2 eyes caught the light, gleaming like amber in the shadows. The figure didn't move. It just stared. "Guys?" Keanu said, his voice low but steady. The joking stopped immediately. His friends followed his gaze, squinting into the woods. One of them, Nate, cursed under his breath. "What the hell is that?" Nate whispered. The creature remained motionless, its stare unwavering. It was enormous, easily taller than any of them, even while hunched. Keanu's pulse quickened. He'd seen depictions of creatures like this in games. Bigfoot, Sasquatch, whatever people wanted to call it. But this wasn't a screen, it was real. Before anyone could act, the thing stood up, Its movement was fluid, almost unnatural for something so large. Then, with a burst of speed that made Keanu's blood run cold, it disappeared into the woods. The group erupted into nervous chatter, debating what they'd just seen. Some wanted to follow the creature, but Keanu shut that idea down immediately. His instincts screamed that it wasn't a good idea. Instead, they decided to pack up and head back to their car. The sun was sinking lower, and the wind had picked up, howling through the trees like a warning. As they made their way back, the creature returned. The first sign was the sound, a deep, guttural growl that stopped them in their tracks. Keanu spun, his heart pounding, just in time to see the massive figure rushing toward them. It slammed into Nate, knocking him to the ground. The others shouted and raised their rifles, but the creature was gone before anyone could get a shot off, vanishing into the trees with an uncanny silence. They rushed to Nate, who was dazed but alive, a nasty gash on his arm where the creature's claws had grazed him. Keanu helped him up, his mind racing. They couldn't stay here, but they also couldn't outrun whatever this was. With night falling, the group decided to make camp in a small clearing and wait for daylight. Keanu built a fire, the crackling flames a small comfort against the encroaching darkness. The wind whistled through the trees, masking any sounds the creature might make as it circled them. As they huddled around the fire, Keanu's thoughts drifted to his family. He thought of his younger brother, who used to stay up late with him playing games about mythical creatures and survival. His brother had always joked that Keanu would be the one to survive if something like this ever happened. Keanu clenched his fists, determined to prove him right. The night was tense. Shadows flickered at the edge of the firelight, and every snap of a twig sent the group scrambling for their rifles. Keanu couldn't shake the feeling that the creature was toying with them, testing their limits. By dawn, they were exhausted, but alive. The wind had calmed, and the light gave them the courage to move. Supporting Nate, they began the slow trek back to their car. The woods felt endless, every shadow a potential threat. Then, they saw it. The creature was ahead of them, standing in their path. It didn't move, just watched as they froze in fear. Keanu motioned for the others to stay quiet. Slowly, he led the group in a wide arc, keeping as much distance as possible between them and the creature. They reached the car just as the sun broke fully over the horizon. Keanu shoved Nate into the back seat as the others piled in. The engine roared to life, and Keanu floored it, the tires kicking up dirt as they sped away. When they finally reached the safety of a small town, they called for help. Nate was taken to the hospital, his injury treated as an animal attack. The others debated what they'd seen, but none of them had an answer. Keanu didn't care. All he knew was that he'd never set foot in those woods again. As they sat in a diner later that day, Keanu's phone buzzed with a message from his brother. It was a link to a new survival game. Keanu laughed bitterly, shaking his head. Some things, he thought, were better left to fiction. The cold in Maine was nothing like the winters Arnold Oldman knew back in Mississippi. The frost here bit deeper, the air sharper, as if the whole world had been stripped bare and left exposed. He adjusted his gloves and stamped his boots, trying to fight the creeping numbness in his toes. Around him, the forest stretched endlessly, a maze of skeletal trees whose branches tangled against a gray, cloud-heavy sky. The occasional whisper of wind sounded almost like a voice. Arnold was an ambulance driver back home, used to fast decisions and stressful situations, but this hunting trip was supposed to be the opposite, a chance to slow down, disconnect, and breathe. Instead, the oppressive silence of the woods was starting to weigh on him. It had been 3 days now, and the only thing they'd bagged was a pair of squirrels. The snow, heavy on the ground and still falling in soft flakes, muffled every step, making the world seem smaller and eerily close. He stood with his hunting rifle slung over his shoulder, waiting for his two companions, Ted and Frank, to catch up. The three of them had been friends for years, their bond forged on long late-night hunting trips and shared bottles of whiskey. Ted was lagging behind, muttering something about his bad knee, while Frank fiddled with a compass, his brow furrowed. "Compass is acting up again," Frank said. "Keeps spinning like it's lost its mind." Arnold raised an eyebrow. "Maybe it knows something we don't." Frank snorted, but there was no humor in it. "These woods are cursed, I'm telling you." Arnold didn't laugh. He'd heard whispers about the Maine wilderness before he came here. Stories about people vanishing, strange lights at night, and an ancient, hungry presence that stalked the trees. Wendigo, they called it. He dismissed it all as tall tales, the kind of folklore you'd find in a late-night internet rabbit hole. But now, standing in the shadow of the trees, he wasn't so sure. "Come on," Arnold said, motioning for them to keep moving. "We'll make camp before the sun sets." They trudged on, the snow crunching softly under their boots. By the time they found a suitable clearing, the clouds had darkened, threatening more snow. Arnold set to work building a fire while Ted and Frank prepared the tent. The flames licked hungrily at the cold air, casting flickering shadows across the snow-covered ground. As they ate their meager dinner, a strange sound broke the quiet. It was faint at first, like the distant creak of an old tree bending in the wind. But then it came again, louder, closer. A long, mournful wail that sent a shiver down Arnold's spine. He glanced at Ted and Frank. Their faces mirrored his unease. "You hear that?" Ted whispered. "Probably just the wind," Arnold said, though his grip tightened on his rifle. The sound came again, this time joined by a rustling in the trees. Arnold's pulse quickened. The fire suddenly felt too small, its light barely reaching the edges of the clearing. He peered into the darkness, his breath clouding the air, and then he saw it. A pair of eyes, glowing faintly yellow, stared back at him from the shadows. The creature was tall, impossibly so, its emaciated frame covered in patches of fur and taut, grayish skin. Its antlers, long and jagged, scraped the branches above it. For a moment, Arnold thought it was a trick of the light, but then it moved, stepping closer with an unnatural grace. "Get behind me," Arnold hissed, raising his rifle. Frank let out a string of curses as Ted scrambled for his weapon. But before anyone could act, the creature let out a guttural roar and lunged. Arnold fired, the shot echoing through the trees, but the thing was too fast. It slammed into Frank, sending him sprawling into the snow. Ted screamed, firing blindly into the darkness as the creature vanished back into the woods. "Frank!" Arnold shouted, rushing to his friend. Frank was alive but shaken, his coat torn and blood seeping from a shallow gash on his arm. "We need to go," Ted said, his voice trembling. "Now," Arnold nodded. They extinguished the fire and started moving, half carrying Frank as they navigated the maze of trees. The creature was still out there. They could feel it, stalking them, its presence a constant pressure at their backs. The cloudy sky made it impossible to tell which direction they were heading, but Arnold kept his focus on one thing: getting out. The snow fell harder now, the flakes swirling like ash in the air. Arnold's legs burned as they climbed a steep hill, and his lungs ached from the cold. Behind him, Ted muttered prayers under his breath, while Frank gritted his teeth against the pain. Then they heard it again, that wail, closer this time, echoing through the trees like a siren. Arnold stopped, scanning the woods. A shadow flickered between the trunks, too fast to track. "Keep moving," Arnold said, his voice firm. "Don't stop." They pressed on, their footsteps crunching softly in the deepening snow. Arnold's mind drifted to his family, his younger sister back in Mississippi, who always worried about him taking these trips. She'd begged him to be careful, her voice full of the same concern she used when talking about his job. "You're always running toward danger," she'd said. He'd laughed it off then, but now he wished he'd listened. The forest seemed endless, each tree a mirror of the last. Arnold's heart sank as he realized they might be going in circles. But then, through the dense fog of snow, he saw the faint glow of lights. "A town," he said, hope rising in his chest. "Come on." They pushed forward, the lights growing brighter with each step. But the creature wasn't done with them. It let out another roar, this one so close that Arnold could feel it reverberate in his chest. He turned just in time to see the shadowy figure charging toward them. "Run!" Arnold shouted. They sprinted, adrenaline overriding exhaustion. The creature was right behind them, its heavy footfalls shaking the ground. Arnold grabbed Frank, practically dragging him as they stumbled toward the lights. The moment they reached the edge of the forest, the creature stopped. Arnold turned, breathing hard, and saw it standing just beyond the tree line, its glowing eyes fixed on them. Then, without a sound, it melted back into the shadows. They stumbled into the small village, collapsing in front of a gas station. A kind stranger helped them inside, offering hot coffee and a phone to call for help. Arnold didn't bother explaining what had happened. He knew no one would believe him. As he sat there, trembling and staring out the window at the dark forest, one thought kept running through his mind. Some stories aren't meant to be dismissed. George Goodson liked the crisp smell of autumn leaves, the way they crunched underfoot, and the sharp, invigorating chill that came with October mornings. It reminded him of Poughkeepsie, the town he called home, nestled by the Hudson River, where the fiery foliage and the cold snap of autumn felt like old friends. But this trip, 3 days deep into the forests of upstate New York, had turned into something else entirely. He adjusted his jacket against the biting wind that swept through the trees, carrying with it an eerie whistling that almost sounded deliberate. The fire he'd built danced weakly, its light barely cutting through the encroaching darkness. George was used to long hours in tense situations. He was a firefighter, after all, but the stillness here unnerved him in ways even raging flames couldn't. He sat by the fire, listening to the distant rustle of branches. It had been there all evening, a sound that came and went, circling, too deliberate to be the wind, but too far away to see. He told himself it was nothing. A raccoon, maybe, or a deer. Still, his fingers hovered near his hunting knife, and his eyes kept darting to the dark line of trees beyond the fire's glow. The first night had been fine, peaceful even. He'd spent the day hiking and setting up camp, enjoying the solitude. The second day had been uneventful too, until dusk. That's when the sounds began. Low, guttural noises, almost like a growl, and the snapping of twigs in the underbrush. George hadn't seen anything, but he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The sensation was so strong it had driven him back to camp early, where he'd built the fire higher than usual. Now, as he stared into the flames, he couldn't ignore it anymore. Something was out there. The wind picked up again, howling through the trees like a living thing. The fire sputtered, casting wild shadows that made the surrounding woods look alive. And then he saw it. A pair of eyes glinting in the darkness, just beyond the firelight. They didn't blink, didn't move, just stared, unyielding and unnerving. George froze, his breath catching in his throat. "Who's there?" he called out, trying to sound authoritative, though his voice wavered. The eyes shifted slightly, and a shape emerged, a tall, gaunt figure, its limbs too long, its movements jerky and unnatural. For a brief, horrible moment, George thought it looked almost human, but something was wrong. Its skin seemed to ripple like it didn't quite fit, and the way it moved sent a chill down his spine. The creature tilted its head, studying him. George grabbed his knife and stood slowly. "Stay back," he said, his voice firmer now. The thing didn't move closer, but it didn't retreat either. It just circled, its steps slow and deliberate, always just outside the fire's reach. The wind howled louder, and the creature vanished into the shadows. George's heart pounded as he scanned the tree line, gripping his knife so tightly his knuckles ached. For several minutes, nothing happened. The woods were silent again, save for the wind and the crackling of the fire. But he knew it was still out there, watching. By dawn, he'd had enough. He wasn't staying another night, not with whatever that thing was lurking in the woods. He packed his gear in record time, keeping his knife close and his eyes scanning the trees. The wind was relentless now, shaking the branches above him and scattering leaves across the ground. He needed to find the trail that led back to the village, but the swirling wind made everything look the same. He'd been walking for about an hour when he heard it again. That guttural growl, closer this time. He turned, and there it was, standing in the path behind him. The creature's body seemed to ripple and shift, its skin writhing like it was alive. George didn't hesitate. He ran. The forest seemed endless, the trees blurring together as he sprinted, dodging low-hanging branches and leaping over roots. The creature was behind him, its footfalls heavy, its breaths loud and ragged. George's lungs burned, but he didn't stop. He couldn't. The path eventually opened into a clearing, and there in the distance, he saw the faint outline of buildings. The village. Relief surged through him, giving him the strength to push on. The creature let out a piercing shriek, a sound so unnatural it made George's stomach churn. But he didn't look back. He ran until he was past the tree line, until he could see people, until he knew he was safe. He collapsed near a small general store, gasping for air. A concerned villager helped him inside, offering water and a blanket. George didn't tell them what had happened. Who would believe him? He barely believed it himself. As he sat there, staring out the window at the forest, he thought about his family back in Poughkeepsie. His younger brother, who always begged him to bring back stories from his adventures. His parents, who worried every time he left for a trip like this. He thought about calling them. But what would he say? That he'd seen something impossible? He'd learned one thing for certain. Some stories are better left untold. The cabin stood isolated in the dense Louisiana woods, its weathered timbers sagging under the weight of time and moss. Robert Russell sat near the crackling fire in the cabin's main room, his grease-stained hands turning a tin mug of coffee. The mechanic from Texas had always been drawn to quiet, remote places. Maybe it was the hours spent in his garage back home, where the hum of engines felt like company. His three friends, Jeff, Andy, and Luke, had insisted on this trip, a break from their usual routines. Winter in Louisiana was supposed to be mild, a getaway from the harsher freezes farther north. But tonight, the air carried a damp chill, and the sky hung heavy and gray. Clouds pressed low against the tops of the trees, and the woods outside felt impenetrable. They had arrived earlier that afternoon, hauling coolers and gear into the cabin, laughing about the long drive. Now, the atmosphere felt different, like the forest had grown watchful. The first sound came just after dark, a faint guttural call that carried through the trees like the echo of an animal. Robert froze, his cup halfway to his lips. Jeff, sitting across the fire, raised an eyebrow. "Coyotes," Jeff offered, though his voice lacked conviction. Robert shook his head. "Doesn't sound right. Too deep." Andy dismissed it with a shrug. "Plenty of weird critters out here. Let's not start spooking ourselves." Robert had heard stories, though, from customers at his shop back home. Stories of strange creatures that prowled the deep woods, of things best left unseen. Skinwalkers, they called them. He'd always thought it was nonsense, tall tales for people who wanted to feel like their backyard was special. Now he wasn't so sure. The second sound came closer. A low, mournful moan that seemed to vibrate through the trees. Everyone fell silent, the fire's crackle suddenly too loud. Luke glanced at the window, his face pale. "Maybe we should check it out," he said, though he didn't move. Robert stood, his legs heavy. "Stay here. I'll go." He grabbed the flashlight from the table, the beam slicing through the cabin's gloom as he stepped outside. The forest was darker than he expected. The flashlight's narrow glow barely penetrated the tangle of branches, and the damp air muffled every sound. He turned slowly, scanning the tree line. The clouds above seemed to press closer, swallowing the moonlight. Then he saw it, or thought he did, a shape taller than any animal he'd ever seen, standing just at the edge of the light. It didn't move, but its presence was suffocating. Robert froze, his breath catching in his throat. "Hello," he called, his voice wavering. The shape stepped forward, and the beam of the flashlight caught it. Robert wished it hadn't. The creature's limbs were unnaturally long, had its skin pale and stretched too tightly over its frame. Its face was wrong, almost human, but not quite. Its eyes glinted with an intelligence that made Robert's stomach churn. It let out a low, guttural noise, something between a growl and a chuckle. Robert backed away, his boots crunching on the frozen ground. The creature didn't follow, but it didn't retreat either. It just stood there, watching him. Somehow that was worse. He stumbled back into the cabin, slamming the door behind him. His friends jumped at the noise. "What the hell was it?" Jeff asked, but Robert couldn't speak. He just shook his head, his hands trembling. The fire flickered, casting uneasy shadows on the cabin walls. They huddled around it, listening to the creature's footsteps outside. It circled the cabin, its movements deliberate, almost taunting. Every now and then they heard that guttural noise, closer each time. "We need to get out of here," Robert finally said. His voice was firm now, a mechanic's practicality cutting through the fear. "Pack up. We're leaving." They moved quickly, throwing their gear into bags. The car was parked a short walk from the cabin, but every step felt like a mile. The creature's presence pressed against them, though they couldn't see it. The woods felt alive, the wind whistling through the branches like a warning. Jeff carried the lantern, its flickering light their only guide through the oppressive dark. Robert kept his hunting knife in hand, though he doubted it would do much against whatever was out there. The wind picked up, rattling the trees, and the creature's moan echoed again, so close now it felt like it was right behind them. Luke tripped, his scream cutting through the night. Robert spun, the flashlight beam catching a glimpse of the creature's face. Too close, its mouth twisted into a grotesque grin. It reached for Luke, but Robert grabbed him, dragging him to his feet. "Run!" he shouted. The group broke into a sprint, the path barely visible beneath their frantic steps. The creature didn't follow immediately, but they could hear it, its footsteps heavy, deliberate, just far enough behind to keep them running. When they finally reached the car, Robert fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking. The others piled in, slamming the doors, their breaths coming in gasps. The creature emerged from the tree line, its eyes catching the headlights. For a moment it just stared, its body half hidden in shadow. Then it let out a screech, the sound piercing and unnatural, and lunged forward. Robert didn't wait. He floored the gas, the tires spinning in the mud before catching. The car lurched forward, leaving the creature behind, its screeching cry fading into the distance. They drove in silence, the weight of what they'd seen settling over them. Robert's hands gripped the wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. He thought of his father, a man who had taught him to keep calm under pressure, to fix things when they broke. But this was something he couldn't fix. When they reached the nearest town, they stopped at a diner, its bright lights a stark contrast to the oppressive dark they'd left behind. Robert called his brother, his voice steady despite the fear still clawing at his chest. "We're okay," he said, though he wasn't sure he believed it. As he hung up, he looked out the window at the woods beyond. The stories he dismissed as nonsense suddenly felt all too real, and he knew, deep down, that something was still out there, waiting. The road was a thin thread winding through New York State's vast expanse of snowy wilderness. Russell Oldman gripped the steering wheel tightly as the SUV slid slightly on an icy patch. He had years of practice handling slippery conditions. Detroit winters could be brutal, and as a delivery driver, he'd learned to respect the road. The difference here, though, was the isolation. There wasn't another car in sight, just endless miles of trees blanketed in white. The road trip had been Jeff's idea, a break from their busy lives and a chance to see some of the Northeast's natural beauty. Along with Russell, there were three others. Jeff, a laid-back photographer, Annie, the group's chatterbox, and Matt, quiet and always reading something on his phone. They planned to explore a few scenic areas before heading back to the city, but the snowstorm earlier in the week had delayed them, leaving them with only one day in the wild. The day had started calm. The group stopped at a diner in a small town for breakfast, the kind of place where locals nodded politely but kept to themselves. Russell had enjoyed the warm coffee and hearty pancakes, a welcome change from the quick meals he usually grabbed between deliveries. As they drove deeper into the forested area, the group's mood shifted. The woods had a stillness that wasn't peaceful but heavy, as if the trees themselves were waiting for something. Even Annie grew quiet, her gaze fixed out the window. Russell adjusted the radio, but All he got was static. They pulled over at a trailhead to stretch their legs. The sign advertised a short loop through the woods, leading to a frozen lake. "Shouldn't take more than an hour," Jeff said, slinging his camera bag over his shoulder. The trail was narrow, smut moldwood, the snow crunching under their boots. The air was calm, with no wind to disturb the thick blanket of snow. Russell took in the scenery, appreciating the serenity, but also noticing how the trees seemed to close in around them. "Hey, check this out," Jeff called, pointing ahead. Russell squinted. At first, he saw nothing unusual, just another cluster of trees, but then he spotted it. A figure crouched behind one of the larger trunks. It was pale, almost blending with the snow, and its limbs were unnaturally long. Its head tilted slightly as if watching them. "Is that a person?" Annie asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "No one's out here," Matt muttered. Russell stepped forward, the others following hesitantly. The figure didn't move, and as they got closer, Russell's stomach tightened. Its face wasn't quite right. The features were there, eyes, nose, mouth, but they seemed misplaced, as if someone had sketched a face from memory and gotten the details wrong. Then it moved. Slowly, deliberately, it shifted its weight and stood up to its full height. It was taller than any of them, its limbs thin but unnervingly strong-looking. "Back to the car," Russell said, his voice steady but firm. The group turned, trying to maintain a calm pace, but the sound of snapping branches behind them quickened their steps. Russell glanced over his shoulder and saw the creature following, its movements fluid and unnatural. When they reached the car, Russell fumbled with the keys, his hands trembling. Come on," Jeff urged. The creature was closer now, its pale form stark against the dark trees. It lunged just as Russell managed to unlock the doors. The group piled in, slamming the doors shut. Russell started the engine, but the SUV refused to move, the tires spinning uselessly on the ice. "Out!" Russell yelled. "We're running!" They abandoned the car, heading back toward the trail. The creature slammed against the SUV, its strength shaking the vehicle, but it didn't pursue immediately. The group moved silently through the woods, their breaths visible in the frigid air. Russell led the way, his instincts honed from years of navigating tricky routes. The calm air was deceptive. Every sound felt amplified, from the crunch of snow to the occasional snap of a branch. They found a small clearing and paused. Russell built a fire, his hands moving quickly despite the cold. The flames provided some comfort, though the creature's presence loomed. "It's circling," Matt said, his voice barely audible. Russell nodded. He'd seen movement at the edge of the clearing, a flash of pale skin here, a glimpse of those unnaturally long limbs there. It was toying with them, waiting. As the fire crackled, Russell's thoughts drifted to his family. His younger brother had always been the brave one, facing problems head-on. Russell had admired that, even if he didn't say it often. He wondered what his brother would do in this situation. Probably something reckless, but effective. They couldn't stay by the fire forever. The creature was closing in, its guttural noises growing louder. Russell stood, his jaw set. "We move." Quietly. The others followed, their footsteps careful and deliberate. The woods were a maze, but Russell kept his bearings, heading toward the distant sound of a road. The creature attacked once more, leaping from the shadows. It struck Matt, knocking him down. Russell and Jeff pulled him up, the three of them dragging him along as Annie led the way. Matt's limp slowed them, but they couldn't stop. The creature didn't follow immediately, but its guttural noises echoed, reminding them it wasn't far. Finally, the trees thinned and they saw the faint glow of headlights. A truck was parked by the roadside, its driver standing beside it. "Help!" Annie shouted, waving her arms. The driver turned, startled, but quickly waved them over. They climbed into the truck's bed, breathless and shaking. The creature didn't appear, but Russell could feel its presence, lurking just out of sight. As the truck pulled away, the group sat in silence, the relief tempered by the knowledge that something unnatural still prowled the woods behind them.